Imagine a boy born on the cold, unforgiving steppes of Mongolia, destined for greatness but surrounded by enemies. His father, a tribal chief, poisoned when the boy was just 9. His family, abandoned by their own clan, left to starve in the endless grasslands. No army, no wealth, no friends, only the bitter winds and the will to survive. That boy was Temujin, the man the world would one day call Genghis Khan, the most feared and respected conqueror in human history. In just a few decades he would unite the warring Mongol tribes, forge a military machine unlike anything the world had seen, and build an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the edges of Europe. His story is not just about war but about survival, leadership, betrayal, and vision. Today we step into that world, a land of horsemen and blood feuds, where loyalty was earned through courage and weakness was punished without mercy. This is the rise of a man who would change history forever. Before we begin this epic journey, make sure to subscribe, because history this powerful should never be forgotten. The story of Genghis Khan begins in the vast, windswept steppes of Central Asia in the year 1162, though exact dates remain debated by historians. He was born as Temujin, the eldest son of Yasugei, a respected chief of the Borjigin clan, and his wife Holun, a strong-willed woman from the Okanut tribe. The Mongol steppe at this time was a land of endless grasslands, dotted with small encampments of nomadic tribes who lived by herding livestock, hunting, and raiding their neighbors. Life was brutal and survival depended on strength, alliances, and the loyalty of kin. Temujin's birth, according to Mongol legend, was marked by an omen. He is said to have been born clutching a blood clot in his hand, a sign that he was destined to be a great warrior. Such symbolism was important in the Mongol world, where the harsh realities of life were intertwined with superstition and belief in fate. Yasugei saw in his son the promise of leadership, and from an early age Temujin would have been taught the skills necessary for survival: archery, horsemanship, and the art of raiding. The political landscape of the Mongol steppe in the 12th century was fragmented. Dozens of tribes and clans, each led by their own khans, were locked in a cycle of shifting alliances, betrayals, and warfare. The Borjigin clan, though respected, was just one among many competing for influence. To secure his son's future, Yasugei arranged an early betrothal for Temujin when he was only about 9 years old. The practice was common among Mongol tribes. Marriages were tools of diplomacy, binding clans together. Temujin was promised to Borte, a girl from the Conquerat tribe, whose family's support could strengthen the Borjigin position. It was on the journey to deliver Temujin to Borte's family that tragedy struck. While traveling, Yasugei encountered members of the Tatars, a rival tribe. Mistaking their friendly gestures for genuine hospitality, Yasugei accepted food and drink from them. The Tatars, holding an old grudge against him, had poisoned his meal. He managed to return to his camp but soon fell gravely ill. On his deathbed, he gave instructions for Temujin to be returned to his family. Without his father's protection, the boy's future became uncertain. Mongol politics were ruthless, and Yasugei's death left the Borjigin vulnerable. According to custom, the widow Holun might have expected her husband's allies to support her and her children. Instead, the Taichiudi clan, nominal allies, saw an opportunity to eliminate a potential rival. They turned on Holun and her children, expelling them from the tribe and leaving them to fend for themselves in the wilderness. Temujin, still a child, suddenly found himself responsible for helping his mother keep the family alive. The years that followed were a test of endurance. The exiled family had no herds, the core of Mongol wealth, and survived by gathering roots, berries, and wild plants. They fished in the rivers and hunted small animals when they could. Holun instilled in her children a fierce determination to survive and a deep sense of unity. Temujin learned that strength was not only in numbers but in resourcefulness and the will to persist when others would give up. It was during this period of hardship that Temujin began to display qualities that would later define his leadership: discipline, decisiveness, and the ability to command loyalty. Even as a boy, he was respected among his brothers for his judgment and resolve. But survival in the steppe meant more than family solidarity. It required navigating constant danger. Rival tribes roamed the plains and raids could happen without warning. The Borjigin family, weakened and isolated, had to remain vigilant. Temujin's relationship with his half-brother Begter became a point of tension. As the eldest male in the household after Yasugei's death, Begter claimed a share of authority and even sought to marry Holun, according to some sources, a move that would have threatened Temujin's position as future leader. The conflict escalated until Temujin and his younger brother Khazar decided to act. In a decisive and brutal moment, they killed Begter. Though it was an act that might be condemned in other contexts, in the harsh Mongol world it was a statement of authority. Temujin would not allow anyone to challenge his leadership within the family. The young Temujin's trials were far from over. While still in his teens he was captured by the Taichiudi clan, who saw him as a potential threat. He was enslaved, forced to wear a wooden collar to mark him as a prisoner. Yet even in captivity, Temujin observed his enemies closely, learning their weaknesses and the dynamics of tribal politics. His escape, aided by a sympathetic guard, was an early example of his ability to inspire loyalty, even from those outside his clan. Once free, Temujin began to re-establish connections with allies of his father and with tribes that might be sympathetic to his cause. One of his first priorities was to honor the betrothal to Borte. He traveled to the Conquerat tribe and married her, securing not only a loyal partner but also the political alliance her family represented. Borte's influence would be significant in Temujin's life. She was known for her wisdom and resilience, and her support would prove invaluable during the years of conquest to come. At this stage, Temujin was not yet a great Khan. He was a young man with a small but growing band of followers. His ambitions, however, were clear. The steppe was ruled by shifting coalitions of tribes, but Temujin envisioned something different, a unified Mongol nation under a single leader. To achieve this, he would need to challenge the traditional aristocracy, reward loyalty over noble birth, and create a military system based on merit rather than family ties. The seeds of that vision were already being planted. Temujin reorganized his followers into units based on loyalty rather than kinship. He formed alliances with other rising leaders including Jamuka, a childhood friend who shared his dream of power, though their friendship would eventually turn to rivalry. Temujin also began to adopt strict codes of discipline, punishing theft and betrayal severely, which earned him a reputation for fairness and order in a world where chaos was the norm. By his early 20s, Temujin's name was becoming known beyond his immediate allies. He had survived betrayal, exile, and enslavement. He had forged new alliances and built the beginnings of a disciplined fighting force. The path ahead would be filled with battles, both against rival tribes and against the entrenched traditions of Mongol politics. But the boy who had once been abandoned in the wilderness was now a leader with a vision, and the steppe was beginning to take notice. This was the first step in Temujin's transformation into Genghis Khan, a journey that would soon erupt into a campaign of unification and conquest, changing the face of the known world. By the mid-1180s, Temujin had emerged as a serious contender for leadership among the Mongol tribes. His survival from childhood exile had forged a hardened, decisive character, and his early years as a minor leader demonstrated his ability to win loyalty from people who had no obligation to follow him. Yet in the volatile political world of the Mongolian steppe, power could be gained quickly, and lost just as fast. One of the most significant relationships in Temujin's life at this stage was with Jamuka, a charismatic and ambitious young noble who, like Temujin, dreamed of uniting the tribes. The two had known each other since boyhood, and by Mongol tradition, they had sworn anda, blood brotherhood, a bond considered sacred and unbreakable. For a time their interests aligned. Together they sought to challenge the existing order, dominated by aristocratic families who used birthright, rather than merit, as the measure of leadership. Temujin's vision for leadership was revolutionary in its simplicity: promote men based on loyalty and skill, regardless of their family background. This idea appealed to many warriors from lower-ranking clans, men who had been overlooked or exploited by the traditional nobility. It also threatened the entrenched power of the Mongol elite, who saw in Temujin a dangerous challenge to their authority. To strengthen his position, Temujin consolidated alliances with key tribes. His marriage to Borte had secured the support of the Conquerat, but he knew he needed more. He reached out to the Kharet, a powerful tribe led by Togrul, known to the Mongols as Ong Khan. Togrul had been an ally of Temujin's father and was willing to support Temujin's rise, at least for the time being. With this alliance, Temujin gained valuable military support and increased his standing among the steppe tribes. The new coalition faced its first major test when tragedy struck close to home. Not long after their marriage, Borte was kidnapped during a raid by the Merkit tribe, longtime enemies of Temujin's family. This was more than a personal insult. It was an attack on his honor and a direct challenge to his authority. Temujin responded decisively. He called upon his allies, Jamuka and Togrul, to help mount a rescue. The combined forces of Temujin, Jamuka, and the Kharet swept down upon the Merkit in a swift and devastating campaign. Borte was rescued, though she was pregnant by the time she returned, and the child, Joki, would always be shadowed by whispers about his paternity. Temujin, however, recognized him as his son and raised him without public question, a decision that reinforced his image as a pragmatic and fair leader. The victory over the Merkit not only restored Borte but also demonstrated Temujin's ability to coordinate large-scale operations, a skill that would define his later conquests. For a time, the partnership with Jamuka flourished. In 1187, Temujin's growing reputation led a council of tribes to proclaim him Khan of the Mongols. However, this proclamation was not recognized by all, and Jamuka, despite his friendship, believed that leadership should be his by right of noble lineage. The differences in their visions for leadership, meritocracy versus aristocracy, began to drive them apart. The split came to a head in 1187, when Temujin formally broke with Jamuka and took with him around 20,000 warriors, a substantial number but still fewer than Jamuka's following. Jamuka reacted swiftly, gathering an army of 30,000 and striking against Temujin's forces at the Battle of Dalan Balshut. The battle was fierce, fought on the rolling plains with cavalry charges and relentless archery. Temujin's forces initially held their ground, but Jamuka's numerical advantage proved decisive. Temujin's army was routed. The defeat was catastrophic not just militarily but politically. Jamuka inflicted a particularly brutal punishment on Temujin's captured men. He executed 70 young warriors by boiling them alive, an act that horrified even his own allies. The cruelty damaged Jamuka's reputation, and many of his followers began to question his leadership. Temujin, though battered, had survived, and his emphasis on discipline and fairness now seemed all the more appealing in contrast to Jamuka's brutality. In the aftermath of Dalan Balshut, Temujin went into a period of rebuilding. He retreated to the safety of the Karaite under Togrul's protection, regathering his followers and forging new alliances. He worked tirelessly to reorganize his forces, continuing to promote men based on merit and loyalty rather than birth. His army was divided into decimal units, groups of 10, 100, and 1,000, each commanded by officers chosen for their competence. This system increased efficiency and reduced the infighting common in tribal armies. It was during this period that Temujin began to adopt and enforce a set of laws and regulations known as the Yasa. While the full details of this code remain somewhat mysterious, it is clear that it addressed matters of military discipline, civil administration, and social conduct. Theft, betrayal, and desertion were punished severely, while loyalty and bravery were rewarded. By enforcing a uniform code, Temujin was able to create cohesion among warriors from different tribes, a feat rarely achieved in Mongol history. As his power grew, so did the threats against him. The Tatars, longtime enemies of the Borjigin, were a formidable force allied with the powerful Jin dynasty of northern China. In the early 1190s, Temujin, with the support of Togrul, launched a campaign against the Tatars, seeking both revenge for his father's death and an opportunity to demonstrate his military skill. The campaign was a success. The Tatars were defeated, their leaders executed, and their people absorbed into Temujin's growing confederation. This victory solidified Temujin's reputation as a capable and ruthless leader. However, it also brought him into closer contact, and eventual conflict, with the Jin dynasty. The Chinese rulers of the Jin saw the steppe tribes as both a buffer and a threat, often using one tribe to weaken another. Temujin understood this dynamic and sought to position himself as a useful ally rather than a dangerous enemy, at least in the short term. Despite the growing external threats, internal politics remained a constant challenge. His alliance with Togrul, though strong, was not without strain. Togrul was a seasoned leader with his own ambitions, and some of his advisors resented Temujin's rising influence. Tensions would simmer for years before erupting into open conflict. By the late 1190s, Temujin had rebuilt his strength and expanded his influence beyond what it had been before his defeat to Jamuka. He had proven himself in battle, forged strategic marriages for his children to strengthen alliances, and brought a degree of order to the chaotic politics of the steppe. His reputation was no longer just that of a skilled warrior. He was now seen as a lawgiver, a commander, and a leader capable of uniting the Mongols under a single banner. Yet the steppe was far from unified. Jamuka, though weakened, still posed a threat, and other tribes, some resentful of Temujin's rise, others fearful of his growing power, remained outside his coalition. The stage was set for a new series of conflicts that would determine who would become the undisputed ruler of the Mongols. Temujin's journey from an outcast youth to a recognized Khan was remarkable, but it was only the beginning. Ahead lay years of warfare, betrayal, and diplomacy, during which he would face old friends turned enemies, defeat long-standing rivals, and prove himself not only as a master of battle but as a visionary leader who could hold together an empire. By the turn of the 13th century, Temujin had risen from obscurity to become one of the most influential leaders on the Mongolian steppe. He had faced exile, enslavement, and betrayal, yet through resilience, strategic alliances, and a relentless commitment to discipline, he had built a coalition of tribes more stable than any seen in living memory. But the steppe was a land where no victory lasted forever, and his ultimate ambition, to unite all the Mongols under one banner, was still unfulfilled. The greatest obstacle to this ambition remained his former blood brother, Jamukha. Though weakened by his earlier cruelty and political missteps, Jamukha retained a core of loyal followers among the aristocracy, men who preferred the old order in which noble lineage determined status. For them, Temujin's merit-based system was a threat to centuries of tradition. The rivalry between Temujin and Jamukha had already cost thousands of lives, but both men knew that the struggle could not end until one of them was destroyed. The final confrontation between the two took shape in the late 1190s. Temujin's forces, strengthened by years of careful reorganization, were better equipped, more disciplined, and more loyal than ever. His system of decimal military units, Arban 10, Zun 100, Mingan 1000, and Tumun 10,000, allowed for coordinated maneuvers on a scale few steppe leaders had achieved. This was not the loose, clan-based raiding of traditional Mongol warfare. It was a professional army with a clear chain of command and a leader who inspired absolute loyalty. Jamukha, by contrast, relied heavily on the support of traditional nobles whose commitment was often conditional. His forces were large but less cohesive. Nevertheless, he remained a dangerous adversary, capable of rallying powerful tribes to his side when the political winds shifted. The two rivals met in a series of battles that stretched over several years, with fortunes shifting back and forth. In one of these confrontations, Temujin finally dealt Jamukha a decisive defeat. Many of Jamukha's followers, recognizing the inevitable, abandoned him and pledged allegiance to Temujin. But Temujin, ever mindful of the value of reputation, treated captured enemies with a degree of clemency unusual for the time. Those who pledged loyalty were often allowed to serve in his army, provided they swore absolute obedience. This policy not only swelled his ranks but also sent a clear message. Under Temujin, loyalty was rewarded, betrayal punished, regardless of one's past. Jamukha's downfall came not on the battlefield but through betrayal from within his own camp. A group of his remaining followers, hoping to win favor with Temujin, captured him and delivered him to his rival. Temujin, however, refused to take him as a prisoner under such circumstances. Instead, he offered Jamukha an honorable death without shedding blood, in accordance with Mongol custom for nobles. Jamukha accepted, ending a rivalry that had defined much of Temujin's early career. With Jamukha gone, Temujin faced fewer internal rivals, but his path to supremacy was still not clear. Other powerful tribes such as the Naiman in the west and the Tangut in the south, remained outside his control. The Naiman in particular were a formidable power, ruling over a vast territory and commanding large, battle-hardened armies. The confrontation with the Naiman came in the early 1200s. Temujin, now an experienced strategist, used intelligence and deception to undermine his enemy before the decisive battle. According to accounts, he spread false information about the size of his forces, leading the Naiman to underestimate his strength. When battle was joined, his disciplined cavalry outmaneuvered the Naiman forces, breaking them apart and forcing their leader, Tayang Khan, to flee. The victory was complete, and the Naiman lands were absorbed into Temujin's growing empire. By this time, Temujin had established himself not only as a brilliant military commander but also as a master of governance. His Yasa code continued to evolve, covering matters from military discipline to trade regulations and even religious tolerance. In a land divided by constant warfare, his insistence on law and order was revolutionary. Merchants and artisans found protection under his rule, and warriors enjoyed clear rules about spoils and rewards. This stability encouraged loyalty and further expanded his base of support. Temujin also demonstrated remarkable skill in diplomacy. He cultivated relations with the Jin dynasty to the south, using the alliance to secure trade and weapons while avoiding direct confrontation until he was ready. He also established contact with the western Xia, Tangut, kingdom, alternately raiding and negotiating to keep them from allying with his enemies. His strategy was always to isolate opponents before confronting them directly, a method that would serve him well in his later campaigns across Asia and beyond. By 1206, after nearly 2 decades of warfare, alliance building, and reform, Temujin's position was unassailable. A great council or kurultai was called on the banks of the Onon River, attended by leaders from across the steppe. Here the gathered tribes formally acknowledged him as the ruler of all Mongols. It was at this moment that Temujin took the title by which history would remember him, Genghis Khan, often translated as universal ruler or oceanic ruler, symbolizing authority over all who dwelt on the steppe and beyond. The coronation was more than a symbolic act, it was the formal birth of the Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan immediately set about consolidating his rule, appointing loyal generals to key positions, reorganizing territories, and ensuring that his laws were applied uniformly across the new confederation. He rewarded his most trusted companions with leadership roles, not because of noble blood but because of proven loyalty and competence. Among these were Subutai Jebe and Mukali, men whose names would become legendary in the decades of conquest to come. The unification of the Mongols under Genghis Khan was a turning point in world history. For centuries, the steppe tribes had been a fragmented patchwork of warring clans, capable of devastating raids but unable to sustain lasting political unity. Genghis Khan changed that. By combining military genius, administrative skill, and a merit-based system of leadership, he created a foundation upon which an empire of unprecedented scale would be built. His rise from abandoned boy to ruler of the largest continuous land empire in history remains one of the most extraordinary stories of human achievement. The very qualities that had sustained him through hardship, adaptability, decisiveness, and an unshakable sense of purpose, would now drive him to take his people far beyond the steppes. Yet even at the height of his triumph in 1206, Genghis Khan was not content to rule the Mongols alone. His gaze turned outward toward the rich cities of the south and west. The kingdoms of the Jin dynasty, the Western Xia, the Khwarezm Empire, and beyond lay within reach of his cavalry. The years ahead would see the Mongol war machine unleashed on a scale the world had never imagined. But those campaigns, the invasions of China, Central Asia, and Europe, were yet to come. For now, Genghis Khan had achieved what no other had before. He had united the Mongols, imposed order on the chaos of the steppe, and declared himself the master of a people who would change the course of history. The boy named Temujin, once left to starve in the wilderness, had become Genghis Khan, a name that would echo through the centuries, feared and respected in equal measure. The rise was complete, the conquests were about to begin. When Genghis Khan emerged from the Kurultai of 1206 as the supreme ruler of the Mongols, his first priority was to transform his united tribes into a war machine capable of defeating any enemy. The Mongols had always been skilled warriors, masters of horsemanship and archery, able to survive in some of the harshest conditions on earth. But under Genghis Khan, this traditional warrior culture would be molded into a disciplined, professional army with a level of organization, speed, and adaptability that the medieval world had never seen. The foundation of this transformation lay in the structure of the army. Genghis Khan retained the decimal system he had used during his rise to power but applied it across the entire empire. Every soldier belonged to a unit of 10 arban, 10 of these formed a unit of 100 zun, 10 hundreds made 1,000 mingan, and 10,000s formed a tuman. Each unit had its own commander, chosen for ability rather than noble birth. This system allowed orders to flow quickly from the Khan to the front lines and ensured that even small detachments could operate independently with efficiency. Crucially, the arban was not just a combat unit, it was a soldier's family. Men in the same arban lived together, trained together, hunted together, and were responsible for each other's conduct. Desertion or cowardice by one man brought punishment to the entire arban, creating a deep sense of shared responsibility. This bond was one reason Mongol units rarely broke in battle. Genghis Khan also imposed strict discipline on his forces through the evolving Yasa code. Looting without permission, killing without orders, or failing to share spoils fairly were offenses punished by death. Such harsh discipline ensured that the army could move quickly without descending into chaos after a victory. It also encouraged civilians in conquered areas to surrender rather than resist, knowing they would be treated according to the Khan's laws if they submitted. Training was relentless. From childhood, Mongol boys learned to ride horses before they could walk steadily, and they practiced archery daily. The composite bow they carried was a masterpiece of steppe engineering. Made of wood, horn, and sinew, it had a draw weight of over 100 pounds and could send an arrow accurately over 200 meters. Mongol warriors could fire while galloping at full speed, hitting targets to the front, side, or even behind them by twisting in the saddle. Combined with the mobility of their small, hardy horses, each warrior kept 3 or 4 and switched mounts regularly. The Mongol cavalry could travel over 100 kilometers in a single day. Logistics were another area where Genghis Khan innovated. His armies carried minimal supplies, relying instead on their herds for food and milk, and supplementing their diet with hunting and foraging. Each warrior carried dried meat, curds, and a water flask, enabling the army to operate in areas where conventional forces would have starved. Herds of spare horses and livestock followed the main army, providing fresh mounts and food as needed. This self-sufficiency meant the Mongols could campaign in any season and in almost any terrain, from the frozen rivers of Russia to the deserts of Central Asia. Intelligence gathering was equally important. Genghis Khan established a network of scouts and spies who moved ahead of the main army, mapping terrain, counting enemy forces, and identifying weaknesses. This information allowed the Khan to plan battles with precision and to exploit enemy mistakes. In many cases, the Mongols knew more about their opponents' lands than the defenders themselves. One of the most feared aspects of the Mongol military was its mastery of psychological warfare. Before an invasion, Genghis Khan often sent emissaries to demand submission. Those who accepted were spared and often incorporated into the empire. Those who refused faced total destruction. Word of Mongol brutality, whether exaggerated or not, spread quickly, and entire cities sometimes surrendered without a fight rather than risk annihilation. The first major test of this reformed Mongol army came against the Tangut Kingdom of Western Xia in 1207. Located in what is now northwestern China, Western Xia was a wealthy and well-defended state with fortified cities and a strong military tradition. The campaign demonstrated the Mongols' ability to adapt to new forms of warfare. Lacking experience in siegecraft, they recruited and coerced Chinese engineers to build siege weapons, catapults, battering rams, and mobile towers. They also cut off supply lines and used feigned retreats to lure Tangut forces into the open, where the Mongol cavalry could destroy them. After several years of intermittent campaigning, Western Xia submitted, becoming a vassal state of the Mongol Empire. This victory was significant not only for its territorial gains but also because it gave the Mongols access to Chinese siege technology and engineers, resources they would use to devastating effect in future campaigns. The next target was the powerful Jin dynasty of northern China. The Jin ruled a vast territory and commanded huge armies, but they were slow-moving and heavily reliant on fortified cities. Genghis Khan knew that a direct assault on their strongest positions would be costly, so he began with a campaign to isolate and weaken them. Starting in 1211, the Mongols launched raids into Jin territory, avoiding heavily defended areas and instead striking at vulnerable supply lines, outposts, and unprotected towns. The Mongols employed their signature tactic of the feigned retreat, drawing Jin armies out of their fortifications and into the open, where they were surrounded and annihilated. Over time, the Jin military was worn down, its morale shattered by repeated defeats in the field. By 1213, Mongol forces were deep inside Jin territory, raiding with impunity and forcing the dynasty to retreat southward. These campaigns revealed the essence of the Mongol war machine: speed, adaptability, discipline, and the ability to combine steppe cavalry traditions with siegecraft and other foreign techniques. Unlike many medieval armies which disbanded after a campaign season, the Mongol army was a permanent, year-round force. This allowed Genghis Khan to maintain pressure on his enemies and to exploit opportunities as they arose, without the delays that often plagued feudal militaries. By the early 1210s, Genghis Khan had demonstrated that his army could not only defeat rival tribes but also crush established kingdoms. His combination of military innovation, strict discipline, and strategic flexibility had created a force capable of projecting power across vast distances. The Mongol war machine was now poised to take on even greater challenges, ones that would bring it into direct conflict with some of the most powerful states in Asia. And in 1218, an event on the western frontier of the empire would trigger one of the most destructive campaigns in history: the invasion of the Khwarezm Empire. The Mongols moved like no other army of their time. Their speed, organization, and discipline shocked kingdoms that had relied on slow-moving infantry or heavily armored knights. Once Genghis Khan had united the tribes, he focused on making his army not just large but efficient. Every soldier was trained to ride for days without stopping, carrying dried meat, fermented milk, and water bags to survive in harsh conditions. One key to their success was communication. The Mongols used a relay system of riders who could deliver messages across hundreds of miles in a matter of days. This allowed Genghis Khan to coordinate multiple forces over vast distances, striking different points at the same time. When enemies thought they were facing one army, they often found themselves surrounded by several. The Mongols also made use of detailed intelligence. Scouts were sent far ahead of the main army to study the enemy's land, roads, fortifications, and water sources. They reported back so that Genghis Khan could plan exactly when and where to strike. This scouting system meant that the Mongols were almost never caught off guard. Flexibility was another strength. The Mongols could attack head-on, but they preferred to trick their enemies. One famous tactic was the feigned retreat. The Mongol cavalry would pretend to flee in panic, luring the enemy into breaking formation and chasing them. Once the enemy was stretched out and disorganized, the Mongols would turn suddenly and attack from all sides. Many kingdoms fell for this trick, believing they had won, only to be destroyed minutes later. Their military units were organized in a decimal system. 10 men formed an arban, 10 arbans made a jagan, 100 men, 10 jagans made a mingan, 1,000 men, and 10 minghans made a tumun, 10,000 men. This clear structure allowed orders to pass quickly and kept the army disciplined even in chaotic battles. Every soldier knew his place and role, whether on the front lines, in the flanks, or as part of the reserve. Equipment was chosen for speed and effectiveness. Mongol warriors wore light armor made from leather or lamellar plates, which protected them without slowing them down. Their main weapon was the composite bow, a short but powerful bow made from wood, horn, and sinew. It could fire arrows farther and with more force than most European longbows of the time. A skilled Mongol archer could shoot accurately while galloping at full speed. They also carried lances, sabers, and small shields for close combat. The Mongols were not limited to open-field battles. They learned siege warfare from the Chinese, adapting catapults, battering rams, and early forms of gunpowder weapons. When they attacked cities, they surrounded them completely, cutting off supplies until hunger and disease weakened the defenders. They also used psychological tactics, such as releasing prisoners to spread fear, or massacring one city so that others would surrender without a fight. Discipline was strict. Disobeying orders, stealing from fellow soldiers, or retreating without command could mean execution. However, loyalty was rewarded. Soldiers shared in the loot of conquered cities, and promotions were based on merit rather than birth. A common herder could rise to command thousands if he proved himself in battle. The Mongols also adapted to different terrains. In deserts, they carried extra water skins and moved at night to avoid heat. In mountains, they used lighter horses and moved in smaller groups. In forests, they advanced slowly and cleared paths to prevent ambush. This adaptability meant that no climate or landscape could stop them for long. Enemy kingdoms often underestimated the Mongols because they came from what seemed like a poor, remote region. But once the Mongols began a campaign, they rarely failed. The combination of speed, surprise, and ruthlessness made resistance costly. Many rulers chose to submit rather than face destruction. Those who surrendered were often allowed to keep their positions, as long as they paid tribute and provided soldiers for future campaigns. The Mongol army was not only about fighting. It also carried skilled craftsmen, engineers, and translators. These specialists built siege machines, mapped territories, and negotiated with local leaders. The Mongols valued useful skills from conquered peoples and often spared artisans and scholars, relocating them to serve the empire. This military system became the backbone of Mongol expansion. With it, they swept through Central Asia, crushed kingdoms in Persia, and threatened the borders of Europe and the Middle East. Each victory brought more resources, horses, and manpower, allowing them to launch even larger campaigns. By the time most kingdoms understood how the Mongol war machine worked, it was too late. Their speed, coordination, and willingness to adapt had already made them one of the most feared forces in history. Once the Mongol war machine reached full strength, no neighboring kingdom felt secure. By the early 13th century, Genghis Khan had already proven his army's effectiveness in Central Asia, but he continued refining his strategy to handle different opponents. Every new campaign was studied afterward, and any weaknesses were corrected. This constant improvement made the army even harder to defeat. One of the Mongols' key strengths was their ability to fight on multiple fronts at the same time. Genghis Khan often split his forces into separate armies, each commanded by trusted generals such as Subutai or Jebe. These commanders had the freedom to adapt their tactics on the battlefield while still following the overall plan. This meant that if one army encountered heavy resistance, another could strike the enemy's flank or cut off their retreat. When facing large, organized kingdoms, the Mongols avoided getting trapped in long, exhausting battles. Instead, they disrupted supply lines and forced the enemy to keep moving. This constant pressure drained enemy morale and resources. The Mongols could fight year-round, moving quickly between battle zones, while their enemies often needed months to prepare a single campaign. Fear played a major role in Mongol success. They understood that terror could be as powerful as any weapon. If a city resisted and was captured, the Mongols sometimes executed most of its population. News of such massacres traveled fast, causing other cities to surrender without a fight. This saved the Mongols time and resources, allowing them to move on to the next target. Their military planning was precise. Before attacking, the Mongols gathered information not only on enemy forces but also on politics, trade and rivalries within the target kingdom. They used spies to spread false information and create divisions among enemy leaders. Sometimes they would ally with one faction inside a kingdom, help it overthrow the ruling power, and then turn on their ally once the enemy was weakened. Genghis Khan also integrated conquered soldiers into his army. Instead of killing every defeated warrior, he offered them a choice: serve the Mongols or die. Many chose to serve, bringing their own skills, weapons, and local knowledge. Over time, the Mongol army became a mix of cultures, with Chinese engineers, Persian administrators, and Turkic cavalry all working under one command structure. Their approach to sieges was unmatched for the time. In China, they learned to use massive siege towers and trebuchets capable of throwing stones or burning oil over city walls. In the Middle East, they adapted counterweight trebuchets, which could hurl larger projectiles. They also used early forms of chemical warfare, such as setting fire to pitch-covered arrows or launching flaming pots filled with naphtha. Against fortified cities, they were patient, sometimes waiting months until defenders starved. The Mongols were masters of mobility. Each soldier had several horses, allowing them to switch mounts and travel over 100 kilometers in a single day. This speed meant they could appear where the enemy least expected them. In one famous campaign, Subutai led an army deep into Eastern Europe, defeating several armies that had been unable to gather in time to face him. Their logistics network was also advanced. Supply caravans followed the army, carrying food, spare weapons, and arrow supplies. In newly conquered lands, the Mongols set up way stations, known as yam, where riders could rest and resupply. This network supported not just military campaigns but also communication across the growing empire. Even their withdrawal tactics were dangerous. If forced to retreat, the Mongols left behind small forces to harass the enemy in slow pursuit. These units set traps, destroyed bridges, and poisoned wells. By the time the enemy realized the Mongols had truly withdrawn, it was often too late to launch a counterattack. Cultural and religious tolerance also helped their expansion. Instead of forcing a single belief system, the Mongols allowed conquered peoples to keep their religions, as long as they paid taxes and remained loyal. This reduced rebellion and allowed the Mongols to focus their energy on new campaigns. However, any sign of revolt was crushed quickly and brutally to discourage others. The Mongol war machine's greatest test came when facing organized and wealthy states such as the Khwarezm Empire. In that campaign, Genghis Khan sent envoys to negotiate trade and peace. When the Shah had them killed, the Mongols launched a full-scale invasion. They destroyed city after city with precision and speed, using both cavalry and siege weapons to overwhelm defenses. Within 2 years, the Khwarezmian Empire was effectively gone. Even after Genghis Khan's death in 1227, his successors maintained the military system. His sons and grandsons expanded the empire into Russia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. The basic principles, speed, intelligence gathering, psychological warfare, and adaptability, remained the same. Under leaders like Ogedai Khan and Kublai Khan, the Mongols controlled the largest contiguous land empire in history. However, their methods also had limits. In places like Japan, where storms destroyed their fleets, or in Southeast Asia's jungles, where disease weakened their troops, the Mongols faced challenges they could not overcome. Yet even in these rare defeats, their enemies remembered the fear they inspired. The Mongol war machine worked because it combined discipline, technology, intelligence, and ruthlessness. No single factor guaranteed victory, but together they created an unstoppable force. Whether on the open steppe in the deserts of Persia, or at the gates of European cities, the Mongols fought on their own terms, forcing opponents into situations they could not win. By the mid-13th century, the Mongols had changed the map of Eurasia. Kingdoms that had stood for centuries were gone. Trade routes were under Mongol control, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the edges of Europe. The legacy of their military system lasted long after the empire itself began to break apart. For those who faced them, the Mongol war machine was not just an army, it was a storm that swept away everything in its path. And it all began with the vision of Genghis Khan, who turned a scattered group of steppe tribes into the most feared fighting force of their age. The Mongol invasion of Persia began with an insult that Genghis Khan could not ignore. By the early 13th century, The Khwarezm Empire stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Indus River. It was ruled by Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad, a proud and ambitious monarch. He had expanded his realm rapidly, controlling important cities like Samarkand, Bokhara, and Urgench. Persia sat at the crossroads of trade between East and West, making it a wealthy and strategic prize. Initially, Genghis Khan did not see Khwarezm as an enemy. He saw them as a potential partner in trade. In 1218 he sent a large caravan of merchants to the Shah, carrying goods, fine silks, rare spices and letters of friendship. He wanted to open diplomatic and commercial relations. This gesture was a sign that the Mongols were not only warriors but also willing traders. The caravan arrived in the border city of Otrar, which was under the authority of the governor, Inalchuk. The governor was suspicious of the Mongols, fearing they were spies. Without consulting the Shah, he ordered the arrest of the entire caravan. The goods were seized and the merchants were executed. This act was a direct insult to Mongol honor. When news reached Genghis Khan, he was shocked but restrained. Instead of launching an immediate attack, he sent 3 envoys to the Shah, demanding the governor's punishment and the return of Mongol property. 2 of these envoys were Mongols and 1 was a Muslim, showing Genghis Khan's respect for diplomatic customs. The Shah's response was a fatal mistake. He had the Muslim envoy beheaded and sent the 2 Mongol envoys back with their beards shaved, a deep humiliation in Mongol culture. This was more than an insult, it was a declaration of war. Genghis Khan swore revenge. In 1219 the Mongol war machine began to move toward Persia. The army was well prepared. Genghis Khan organized his forces into 2 munds, units of 10,000 men, each further divided for speed and flexibility. His generals were some of the finest in the world. Subutai Jebe and his sons Joki, Shagatai and Ogidi. The invasion force numbered between 150,000 and 200,000, including cavalry, engineers, and siege specialists. The Mongols brought with them Chinese engineers skilled in building siege engines, mangonels, and catapults. They also had experience in crossing deserts, rivers, and mountains, making them capable of striking anywhere. The Mongols advanced in multiple columns, creating confusion among the Khwarezm defenders. One force moved toward Otrar to punish the treacherous governor. Another swept down toward Bokhara, while others pushed toward Samarkand. Genghis Khan himself led the central army. Otrar was the first to face Mongol wrath. The siege began in late 1219 and lasted for 5 months. The defenders fought bravely but the Mongols were relentless. When the city finally fell, Inalchuk was captured alive. Genghis Khan ordered molten silver to be poured into his eyes and ears, a punishment for his betrayal. While Otrar was under siege, other Mongol forces were already striking deep into Khwarezm territory. In March 1220, Genghis Khan appeared outside Bokhara. The city was one of the jewels of the Khwarezm Empire, rich in culture, trade, and architecture. The Mongols surrounded it and quickly breached its defenses. Genghis Khan entered the city and addressed the people in the mosque, declaring that he was the flail of God, sent to punish them for their sins. Bokhara was looted, and its citadel was destroyed. Many of its inhabitants were killed, and skilled craftsmen were sent back to Mongolia. This destruction sent shockwaves through the region. Samarkand, the capital and pride of the Khwarezm Empire, was next. Samarkand was heavily fortified and had a large garrison, including war elephants. The Mongols used their siege engines to batter the walls and employed feigned retreats to lure the defenders into ambushes. After a brief but intense siege, the city surrendered. The Mongols executed the soldiers and took artisans, scholars, and workers as prisoners. With the heart of his empire collapsing, Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad fled westward. Instead of rallying his forces, he abandoned his cities one by one, leaving them to fall to the Mongols. His retreat spread panic among the population. Genghis Khan now split his army into smaller forces to hunt down the fleeing Shah and to subdue the rest of the empire. Subutai and Jebe were sent with a smaller detachment on a long pursuit, which would eventually take them across the Caucasus and into Eastern Europe. The Mongols swept through city after city, Nishapur, Merv, Herat. The pattern was the same: siege, slaughter, and deportation of skilled workers. The destruction was so great that many of these cities never recovered. By late 1220 the Khwarezm Empire was shattered. Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad, still fleeing, crossed the Caspian Sea to an island, where he died of illness in early 1221. His son Jalal ad-Din tried to resist, but the Mongols pursued him relentlessly. The invasion of Persia was one of the most devastating campaigns in history. Entire cities were erased from the map, trade routes shifted, and the balance of power in the Islamic world changed forever. Genghis Khan had turned an insult into total conquest. His empire now reached deep into the heart of the Middle East. By the spring of 1220, the Mongols had already taken Otrar, Bokhara, and Samarkand, breaking the backbone of Khwarezmian power. But for Genghis Khan, the campaign was far from over. His goal was not just to punish the Shah but to utterly dismantle his empire, making sure no power could rise from its ruins to challenge the Mongols again. While the main Mongol forces consolidated their control over Transoxiana, Genghis Khan gave his most trusted generals new orders. He divided his army into smaller but highly mobile columns, each tasked with sweeping through different parts of the Khwarezmian realm. This tactic allowed the Mongols to attack multiple cities at once, preventing the enemy from regrouping. One of the first targets in this second phase was the city of Termez on the Amu Darya River. Termez was known for its fortifications and stubborn defenders. The Mongols surrounded the city, cutting off supplies and water sources. Siege engines bombarded the walls day and night. When the defenders finally broke, the Mongols stormed in, killing most of the garrison. Surviving craftsmen and engineers were sent east to serve the Mongol state. Meanwhile, Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad continued to flee westward, avoiding any direct confrontation. He hoped to reach the safety of the Caspian Sea and perhaps gain support from neighboring powers. But his flight left his people feeling abandoned. Many cities, seeing no hope of rescue, surrendered without much resistance. One city that did not surrender easily was Merv, a thriving center of learning and trade. The Mongols arrived in early 1221, surrounding it completely. The siege lasted several days. When the gates finally opened, whether through surrender or deceit, Genghis Khan's forces entered with brutal efficiency. Chroniclers claim that more than 700,000 people were killed, although modern historians consider this number exaggerated. Still, the massacre was on a vast scale and Merv was left in ruins. After Merv, the Mongols turned to Nishapur. This city had sentimental importance in the campaign because during earlier fighting in the region, Genghis Khan's beloved son-in-law, Takuchur, had been killed by a Nishapur archer. In retaliation, Genghis Khan's daughter, who was Takuchur's widow, demanded complete destruction. The Mongols complied with terrifying thoroughness. The entire population was executed, and the city was leveled so completely that it became a field of bones. While these massacres shocked the Islamic world, they also served a calculated purpose. The Mongols relied on psychological warfare as much as physical combat. The news of what had happened in Merv and Nishapur spread quickly, and many towns chose to open their gates rather than resist. As the Mongols swept southward, Herat, another major city in Khorasan, faced their wrath. Initially, Herat surrendered without much resistance, but after the Mongols moved on, its citizens rebelled against the occupying force. Genghis Khan could not tolerate such defiance. He sent troops back to Herat, and the rebellion was crushed with heavy bloodshed. In parallel with these sieges, Genghis Khan unleashed one of the most remarkable military expeditions of the era. He ordered his generals Subutai and Jeeb to lead a detachment of around 30,000 men on a long pursuit of the fleeing Shah. Their mission was not only to capture him but also to explore and destabilize new territories. This pursuit would take them thousands of kilometers westward, across the Iranian plateau, through the Caucasus and eventually into Eastern Europe, a campaign that would make Subutai and Jeeb legendary. But for the Shah there was no escape. In late 1220 he reached the shores of the Caspian Sea. Lacking ships or strong allies, he fled to a small island off the coast. Isolated, sick and abandoned, he died in early 1221. His death did not end the Mongol campaign. If anything, it freed Genghis Khan to focus entirely on destroying the remnants of Khwarezmian resistance. The leadership of the resistance now fell to the Shah's son, Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu. Unlike his father, Jalal ad-Din was a skilled commander and brave warrior. He gathered what remained of the Khwarezmian army and attempted to resist the Mongols. His most famous stand came at the Battle of the Indus in 1221. Jalal ad-Din's army faced a massive Mongol force led by Genghis Khan himself. Despite being heavily outnumbered, Jalal ad-Din fought fiercely, even managing to break parts of the Mongol line. But the battle turned against him. In the chaos, Jalal ad-Din leapt into the Indus River with his horse and swam to safety on the far bank. Genghis Khan, watching from a distance, is said to have admired his bravery and ordered his archers not to shoot him. Jalal ad-Din escaped into India, where he sought refuge and tried to build a new power base. However, the Mongols did not pursue him deep into the subcontinent at this time, as Genghis Khan had no immediate interest in a full-scale Indian campaign. With Jalal ad-Din gone, the Mongols turned their attention to securing and consolidating their new territories. Persian cities that had resisted were left in ruins. Those that had surrendered early were often spared wholesale destruction but still had to pay heavy tribute. Skilled artisans, blacksmiths and engineers were transported to Mongolia, enriching the empire's resources. By the end of 1221, the Khwarezmian Empire was effectively erased from the map. Its cities lay in ruins, its trade routes disrupted, and its population scattered or enslaved. The invasion had also sent shockwaves throughout the Muslim world. The Caliph in Baghdad, the rulers of Syria, and the Sultan of the Seljuk Turks all took note of the Mongol threat. For Genghis Khan, the campaign against Khwarezm was both a revenge mission and a demonstration of the Mongol military system's effectiveness. Speed, coordination, and terror had combined to destroy one of the largest and richest states in Asia in less than 2 years. The destruction was so thorough that parts of Persia would take centuries to recover fully. Yet even in their devastation, the Mongol campaigns opened new trade possibilities. The Silk Road now lay almost entirely under Mongol control, and merchants could travel from China to the Middle East under the protection of the Great Khan's rule. For some, this meant unprecedented commercial opportunities. For others, it was a reminder that such peace came at the price of brutal conquest. By 1222, Genghis Khan began preparing for new campaigns. His empire now stretched from the borders of China deep into the Islamic world. The fall of the Khwarezm Empire was a turning point. It marked the Mongols' arrival as a power in the Middle East and set the stage for future clashes with powers like the Abbasid Caliphate and the Mamluks. The Mongol army moved deeper into Persia, systematically dismantling the Khwarezmian state. After the destruction of the major cities in the east, Genghis Khan turned his attention to the western territories that still resisted. Even though Shah Muhammad had fled and later died in exile, the remnants of his forces and loyal governors attempted to hold ground. Genghis knew that as long as these strongholds existed, the Khwarezmian name could still inspire resistance. His strategy was to destroy every major population center that refused to submit, leaving no potential rallying point. The first target in this new phase was the wealthy city of Hamadan. Known as an ancient center of trade and administration, Hamadan had sent messages of defiance to the Mongol commanders. Genghis dispatched a large detachment under the experienced General Subutai. The defenders relied on thick walls and the mountainous terrain for protection. The Mongols, however, had perfected siege techniques and used Chinese engineers to build powerful siege engines on site. They cut off the city's supply routes, ensuring hunger and disease spread among the defenders. After weeks of pressure, the city fell. The Mongols executed many of the male population and enslaved others, continuing the pattern of terror. While Subutai moved west, Genghis sent his other forces to sweep through the Caspian Sea region. They targeted towns along key trade routes, particularly those that connected the Middle East to the Caucasus. These roads had been used for centuries for the transport of silk, spices, and precious metals. By securing them, Genghis not only denied resources to his enemies but also set the foundation for the Mongol-controlled Silk Road. Town after town fell, with the Mongols showing no hesitation in burning settlements that resisted. The remaining Khwarezmian military leaders faced a grim reality. Without the central authority of the Shah, each city and province was left to fend for itself. This lack of coordination was exactly what the Mongols exploited. They would encircle one city, crush it completely, then move swiftly to the next before news could fully prepare the defenders. Their armies could march up to 100 miles in a single day, outpacing any reinforcements. In the city of Tabriz, the local ruler saw the destruction that had befallen other cities and chose to submit peacefully. He paid tribute and offered hostages to ensure Mongol favor. Genghis accepted, showing that submission could spare a city's destruction. This was a deliberate policy. By sparing those who surrendered, the Mongols encouraged other towns to avoid resistance. However, if any hint of betrayal emerged, the punishment was swift and total. As the Mongols advanced toward the Caucasus, they encountered not only Persian defenders but also various ethnic and tribal groups. Many of these had been under Khwarezmian control but were willing to ally with the Mongols in exchange for autonomy. Genghis was pragmatic in such dealings. He allowed allied tribes to maintain their leaders and customs, provided they supplied troops and resources when called upon. This flexibility expanded the Mongol network of influence far beyond the immediate battlefield. The conquest of Persia was not limited to the destruction of cities. It also involved reshaping the region's political landscape. The Mongols placed loyal governors, often chosen from their own ranks or from trusted allies, to oversee newly conquered territories. They established systems of taxation and communication that would later integrate Persia into the vast Mongol Empire. While the brutality of the campaign left scars for generations, it also brought the region into a new phase of long-distance trade and connectivity under Mongol rule. One of the last major acts in this campaign was the pursuit of Shah Muhammad's son, Jalal al-Din Mingburnu. Determined to avenge his father and restore Khwarezmian power, Jalal al-Din gathered an army from remaining loyalists and fled to the west. Genghis saw him as a threat that had to be eliminated. The Mongols chased him through Persia, forcing battles in which Jalal al-Din's forces were outnumbered and eventually defeated. The final confrontation came near the Indus River in 1221. Outnumbered but unwilling to surrender, Jalal al-Din fought fiercely. In the chaos, he famously leapt into the river on horseback and escaped into India. Genghis, impressed by the young leader's courage, reportedly spared the lives of captured soldiers from that battle, a rare gesture of respect for an enemy. With Jalal al-Din in exile and the major cities of Persia in ruins or under Mongol control, Genghis Khan had effectively destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire. The once powerful state, which had commanded vast territories and immense wealth, was reduced to scattered remnants with no central leadership. The Persian heartland was devastated, its population reduced through massacres, enslavement, and flight. Fields lay abandoned, irrigation systems were destroyed, and entire regions became depopulated. Despite the destruction, Genghis Khan's campaign in Persia marked a turning point in Mongol history. It demonstrated the full capability of their military machine on a continental scale. The conquest extended Mongol influence deep into the Islamic world, opening the path for future campaigns into the Middle East and Europe. The fall of the Khwarezm Empire also sent a message to other rulers. The Mongols could not be ignored or underestimated. Any insult or act of defiance could bring the full weight of their retribution. By 1223, the Mongol armies had withdrawn from the Persian interior, leaving behind garrisons and loyal administrators. Their attention shifted to new frontiers: the Caucasus, the Russian steppes, and eventually the heart of Europe. Persia, however, remained firmly within the Mongol sphere and would later play a critical role in the empire's economic and cultural exchanges. The destruction of the Khwarezm Empire was not merely the result of superior tactics. It was the product of a disciplined, highly mobile force guided by a leader who combined strategic vision with uncompromising resolve. Genghis Khan had transformed a personal vendetta into a campaign that reshaped the map of Asia. For the Persians, it was a tragedy of unprecedented scale. For the Mongols, it was a stepping stone toward the creation of the largest contiguous empire in history. Even centuries later, the memory of the Mongol invasion of Persia remained vivid in historical chronicles and folk memory. The name Genghis Khan became synonymous with both unparalleled conquest and ruthless destruction. His campaign in Persia showed the world that no kingdom, no matter how wealthy or powerful, was beyond the reach of the Mongol war machine. By the early 13th century, the Mongol Empire had already expanded far beyond the steppes of Mongolia. Under Genghis Khan and later his successors, the Mongols had subdued northern China, crushed the Khwarezm Empire in Central Asia, and pushed into the lands of the Caucasus. Their armies had fought through mountains, deserts, and rivers, developing a reputation for unstoppable military power. After the death of Genghis Khan in 1227, the Mongol expansion did not slow. His empire was divided among his sons and grandsons, but they ruled as parts of a single vast Mongol state. The westernmost push of the Mongols began under the leadership of Ogedai Khan, the third son of Genghis Khan and his appointed successor. Ogedai, ruling from Karakoram in Mongolia, directed campaigns in every direction. To the west, he gave the task of conquering the lands of the Rus and beyond to his nephew Bata Khan, son of Joki, along with the experienced general Subutai. Bata was the political leader of the campaign, while Subutai was the strategic mind. Subutai had already been one of Genghis Khan's greatest commanders, participating in the invasion of Khwarezm and numerous other campaigns. Now, with Europe in sight, his task was to lead the Mongol war machine into lands no steppe army had ever dominated. The first stage of the invasion of Europe began with the Mongols targeting the principalities of the Rus. In 1237, the Mongols crossed the Volga River and attacked the Ryazan Principality. The city of Ryazan was besieged and destroyed after refusing to submit. This was a pattern that the Mongols followed throughout their expansion: surrender and pay tribute, and the city might be spared; resist and it would be destroyed. The Mongols moved swiftly from one target to the next. After Ryazan, they took Kolomna and then Moscow, which at the time was still a small but growing settlement. The Mongols did not simply overwhelm their enemies with numbers. They used a combination of intelligence gathering, psychological warfare, and careful coordination. Subutai sent scouting parties deep into enemy territory before major attacks, collecting information on terrain, fortifications, and enemy strengths. Messages were often sent demanding surrender, backed by stories of past Mongol victories to intimidate opponents. When a city or fortress resisted, the Mongols would encircle it, cut off supplies, and use siege weapons to breach the walls. By early 1238, the Mongols reached the city of Vladimir, one of the most important centers in the northeastern Rus lands. Vladimir fell after a short siege, and its population was massacred. The Mongols then split their forces to raid widely, ensuring that local defenders could not regroup. Winter was no obstacle to them. They were accustomed to harsh climates and could move their armies even in snow and freezing temperatures. The Mongol invasion devastated the Rus principalities. Cities like Torzhok fell, and the Mongols reached as far as Novgorod's territory, though they did not attempt to take the city itself at that time. Instead, they withdrew to the south to regroup and prepare for the next phase of their campaign. This withdrawal was not a retreat but part of a larger plan. In 1240 the Mongols returned, this time focusing on the southern Rus lands. The city of Kiev, once a powerful center of trade and culture, was besieged. By this time the Mongols had refined their siege techniques, bringing with them engineers from China and the Islamic world who could construct catapults, siege towers, and other advanced equipment. Kiev fell in December 1240 after fierce fighting, and the destruction was catastrophic. Chroniclers wrote of the city being almost completely destroyed, with its population slaughtered or taken as slaves. With the Rus territories subdued, the Mongols now had a gateway into Eastern Europe. Their next targets were the kingdoms and principalities further west, Poland, Hungary, and eventually the borders of the Holy Roman Empire. Bata Khan and Subutai assembled their forces, which included not only Mongol warriors but also soldiers from conquered peoples such as the Turks, Kipchaks, and Chinese siege specialists. The Mongols' march into Europe in 1241 was carefully planned. The army split into multiple columns to confuse and overwhelm their enemies. One force moved north into Poland, while the main army advanced into Hungary. This tactic ensured that European defenders would have to divide their forces, making it easier for the Mongols to defeat them separately. In Poland, the Mongols faced a coalition of Polish knights, Teutonic Order troops, and other local forces. On April 9, 1241, the two sides clashed at the Battle of Legnica, also known as the Battle of Liegnitz. The Mongols used feigned retreats to lure the European cavalry into traps, a tactic they had perfected over decades. Once the European forces were drawn out and disorganized, the Mongols counterattacked with devastating effect. The Polish army was crushed and many nobles were killed. Meanwhile, the main Mongol force entered Hungary, where King Bela IV attempted to gather a large army to resist them. The Hungarians fortified the Danube River and tried to block the Mongols' advance. However, the Mongols found ways to cross rivers and avoid fortified positions, moving quickly to outflank their opponents. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Mohi on April 11, 1241. The Mongols attacked at multiple points, using coordinated assaults to trap the Hungarian forces. The battle turned into a massacre with tens of thousands of Hungarian soldiers killed. After these victories, the Mongols spread out across Central Europe, raiding towns, destroying fortresses, and taking prisoners. They moved with incredible speed, often covering more ground in a week than their enemies could in a month. Supply lines were maintained through the use of remounts. Each warrior had several horses, allowing them to switch mounts and travel longer distances without exhausting their animals. By late 1241, the Mongols were in a position to threaten Vienna, the capital of Austria, and the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. Panic spread across Europe. Reports of the Mongols' cruelty and efficiency reached as far as France and England, where kings and nobles debated how to defend against this seemingly unstoppable force. However, just as it seemed that the Mongols might push even further into Western Europe, events in their homeland altered the course of history. News arrived that Ogedei Khan had died in December 1241. According to Mongol custom, all princes of the royal family had to return to Mongolia for the Kurultai, the great assembly where a new Khan would be elected. Bata Khan halted his advance and began the long journey back to the east. The sudden withdrawal of the Mongols left much of Europe in shock. Many cities and kingdoms had been spared only by the accident of timing. Yet the devastation they left behind was immense. Large parts of Poland and Hungary lay in ruins, with populations reduced and economies shattered. The campaign into Europe demonstrated the reach and power of the Mongol military system. Their ability to coordinate large-scale invasions, adapt to different environments, and integrate siege and cavalry tactics made them one of the most formidable military forces in history. For the Europeans, the Mongol invasion was both a warning and a mystery. Few understood the political structure of the Mongol Empire or the reasons for its sudden departure. Some saw it as divine intervention, others feared that the Mongols would one day return. As the Mongol armies secured their hold over Hungary, Austria, and parts of Poland in early 1242, the European rulers were still in shock at the speed and scale of the invasions. King Bela IV of Hungary was a fugitive in Dalmatia, relying on Venetian ships to protect him from capture. Many Hungarian nobles had been killed at Mohi, and their lands were left leaderless, making them vulnerable to both Mongol raids and opportunistic attacks by neighboring powers. In Poland, Duke Henry II of Silesia was dead, and Krakow had been abandoned. Bohemia, under King Wenceslas I, had managed to avoid a major battle, but its defenses had been hastily strengthened in fear of a Mongol assault that never came. The Teutonic Knights and other crusading orders stationed in the Baltic region were already discussing emergency plans for a potential defense of the Holy Roman Empire's eastern borders. Despite these favorable conditions for further conquest, the Mongols' momentum slowed dramatically in the spring of 1242. Bata Khan and his generals had to reassess their strategic priorities after receiving urgent news from the east: the death of Ogedei Khan, the great Khan of the Mongol Empire, in December 1241. This event triggered the Mongol tradition of calling a Kurultai, a council of the empire's leading princes and commanders, to select a new supreme ruler. No major military campaign could proceed without the consent of the great Khan, and all eligible members of Genghis Khan's family were expected to attend. Batu, as a grandson of Genghis Khan and a major military leader, was obligated to return to Mongolia to participate in the succession process. This requirement effectively halted the Mongol advance into Europe. The armies began a slow, methodical withdrawal from their forward positions. They looted and destroyed towns along their retreat path, ensuring that any potential pursuers would face devastation and scarcity. In Hungary, the Mongols systematically burned villages, destroyed fortifications, and carried away thousands of captives. In Poland and the surrounding regions, the same pattern followed. Fortified towns that had resisted earlier were targeted and destroyed as retribution, and valuable resources were transported eastward. Some historians have speculated that the Mongols might have faced logistical challenges even without the recall to Mongolia. Europe's dense forests, heavy fortifications in certain areas, and inconsistent road systems posed difficulties for large-scale cavalry maneuvers. The weather conditions in Central Europe, particularly during wet seasons, could turn roads into mud and limit the movement of horses and wagons. While the Mongols were adept at adapting to diverse terrains, from the deserts of Central Asia to the mountains of Persia, a prolonged campaign in the varied landscapes of Europe would have required extended supply lines and additional preparation. Nevertheless, contemporary sources suggest that Europe's fragmented political situation and the Mongols' proven ability to adapt meant that they could have pressed further west had it not been for the political obligations in Mongolia. The withdrawal in 1242 did not mean the end of Mongol interest in Europe. Over the next decades, Mongol leaders would continue to engage with European powers through a combination of diplomacy, trade, and occasional military pressure. In some cases, the Mongols sought alliances against common enemies such as the Mamluks in the Middle East. There were even proposals for joint Mongol-European military campaigns, though these never materialized in the way the planners envisioned. Papal envoys traveled to the Mongol court, and Mongol ambassadors appeared in European capitals, often bearing demands for submission alongside offers of cooperation. For the people who had experienced the Mongol invasions firsthand, however, the memory of the destruction was lasting. Hungarian chronicles described entire counties depopulated, with villages left in ruins for decades. In Poland, stories of the swift cavalry attacks and the inability of knights in heavy armor to counter them became part of local folklore. The psychological impact on Europe was significant. Even after the Mongols had left, rulers invested heavily in fortifications, watchtowers, and organized rapid response forces in case the horsemen returned. The legacy of the Mongols' European campaigns was also felt in military thinking. European commanders began to pay closer attention to mobility and coordination, recognizing that a smaller but more maneuverable force could outflank heavily armed troops. The use of mounted archers, a hallmark of Mongol warfare, inspired changes in the composition of some armies, though European terrain and tradition still favored heavy cavalry in most cases. The encounters with the Mongols also expanded Europe's awareness of the wider world. Reports from travelers and envoys who followed in the wake of the armies brought information about distant lands, trade routes, and cultures previously unknown or little understood in the West. In the end, the Mongols' near conquest of Europe remained one of history's great what-if scenarios. Had Genghis Khan lived a few more years, it is possible that Mongol forces could have reached deeper into the heart of the continent, perhaps even challenging the authority of the Pope and the major monarchies of the time. The fragmented nature of European politics in the mid-13th century would have offered many opportunities for the Mongols to exploit rivalries and form temporary alliances to advance their goals. Yet history took a different path, with the Mongols redirecting their focus toward internal politics and campaigns in other regions, including the Middle East and China. The retreat from Europe marked the high-water point of Mongol expansion to the west. While later campaigns would reach into parts of Eastern Europe, the sweeping advance of 1241 to 1242 was never repeated on the same scale. For Genghis Khan, the European campaign added to his prestige and solidified his position within the Mongol leadership, eventually leading to his establishment of the Golden Horde, a powerful khanate that would dominate the steppes north of the Black Sea for centuries. For Europe, the brief but intense clash with the Mongols served as a stark reminder that even the most powerful kingdoms could be threatened by forces from beyond their traditional horizons. The story of the Mongols' push into Europe is not simply one of conquest and retreat. It is also a study in how political priorities, geography, and timing can alter the course of history. The Mongols came closer than any other non-European power to uniting the continent under their rule, yet they withdrew before the decisive battles for Western Europe could take place. In doing so, they left a legacy of fear, respect, and strategic change that would echo through European history for generations to come. By the time the Mongol generals returned to Mongolia, the political landscape of the empire was already shifting. Factional disputes over the succession to the position of Great Khan began to shape the future direction of the Mongol world. Badu's absence from the eventual election of Genghis Khan as Ogedi's successor was deliberate, reflecting the deep divisions that were emerging within Genghis Khan's family line. These divisions would, in time, contribute to the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire, even as individual khanates continued to wield great power in their respective regions. For now, however, the memory of the Mongol horsemen thundering across the plains of Europe remained vivid. In castles and cities from the Danube to the Rhine, people told stories of a time when an unstoppable force had appeared from the east, changing everything they thought they knew about war, power, and the limits of human ambition. The Mongols' departure may have spared Europe from immediate conquest, but the encounter left a permanent mark on the continent's history and identity. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire had reached a size and scope that no previous empire had managed. From the coasts of the Pacific Ocean in the east to the heartlands of Eastern Europe in the west, the empire stretched across vast deserts, high mountain ranges, fertile river valleys, and steppes. Its domains included China, Central Asia, the Middle East, and large sections of Eastern Europe. This enormous territory was not simply conquered and left to fragment. Instead, it was systematically organized, governed, and integrated into a functioning network that facilitated trade, communication, and the movement of armies and information. The result was a period often referred to as the Mongol Peace or Pax Mongolica, which enabled economic growth and cultural exchange across much of Eurasia. The empire's expansion had been rapid. Under Genghis Khan, the Mongols had unified the steppe tribes, overthrown the Khwarezm Empire, and pushed into Eastern Europe. After his death in 1227, his successors, particularly Genghis Khan, his son, continued to extend Mongol power. By the time of Ogedi's death in 1241, Mongol armies had reached Hungary and Poland in the west and had completed the conquest of the Jin dynasty in northern China. This was the moment when the empire began to stabilize and consolidate its gains. The leadership recognized that controlling such a vast domain required more than military strength. It required an administrative framework capable of holding together regions with diverse cultures, religions, and economies. One of the first steps was to establish an efficient communication system. The Mongols created the Yam, a relay network of stations placed along key routes. Each station had fresh horses, supplies, and personnel ready to pass messages or escort officials. This system allowed messages to travel from the far corners of the empire in remarkably short times, sometimes in days what would take weeks for a normal caravan. It also allowed the central court, wherever it was located, to keep track of distant provinces and to respond quickly to crises. Trade became a central feature of Mongol governance. The Silk Road, which had long been a series of loosely connected routes plagued by bandits and unstable local politics, was now brought under a single political authority. Merchants could travel from China to the Mediterranean with a level of safety that had been rare before. The Mongols actively encouraged trade by offering protection to caravans, issuing special passports known as pases to merchants, and reducing tolls and taxes along major routes. This not only enriched the empire but also brought in valuable goods, technologies, and ideas from distant lands. The Mongol court itself was a meeting point for diverse peoples. At Karakoram, the empire's first capital, visitors might encounter Chinese engineers, Persian astronomers, Russian craftsmen, Arab merchants, and European envoys. Each brought knowledge and skills that the Mongols were eager to use. They valued practical expertise over ethnic or religious background, which made their administration more adaptable. For example, in China they employed Confucian scholars to manage records and taxation, while in the Middle East, they relied on Persian bureaucrats with centuries of experience in imperial administration. Religious tolerance was another important factor in the stability of the empire. The Mongols, who practiced their own shamanistic traditions, did not impose their beliefs on subject peoples. Instead, they often protected religious leaders and institutions, regardless of faith. Buddhist monasteries in Tibet, Christian churches in Armenia, Islamic mosques in Persia, and Taoist temples in China all operated under Mongol protection. This tolerance reduced resistance to Mongol rule and made it easier to integrate diverse populations. Economically, the empire thrived on more than just trade. Agricultural production in the conquered territories supported the urban centers and armies. In China, the fertile plains of the north provided grain surpluses. In the Middle East, irrigation systems were repaired or expanded to increase crop yields. Tribute from subject peoples was collected systematically and redistributed to support the court, the military, and public works. In many cases, local rulers remained in place as vassals, paying tribute but keeping day-to-day control of their lands. This arrangement allowed the Mongols to avoid the costs of direct administration in some regions while still benefiting from their resources. Culturally, the empire's peak period was marked by significant exchanges of ideas and knowledge. Papermaking and printing technologies moved westward from China, while glassmaking techniques traveled eastward from the Islamic world. Astronomical knowledge, medical texts, and agricultural practices circulated widely. The Mongols were less concerned with preserving cultural purity than with acquiring useful innovations. This openness accelerated the spread of technologies that would later shape the development of both Asia and Europe. The stability of the Pax Mongolica also made it possible for travelers and explorers to undertake long journeys. One of the most famous was Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who spent years at the court of Kublai Khan in China. His accounts, though sometimes exaggerated, gave Europeans a detailed picture of the wealth and sophistication of the East, fueling later interest in exploration and trade. Similarly, Muslim scholars and merchants traveled across the empire, linking distant Islamic communities and spreading knowledge along the way. The military remained a central pillar of Mongol power even during this peaceful period. The empire's armies were still highly mobile and capable of rapid deployment. This deterred rebellions and kept rival states in check. Even in peacetime, the Mongols conducted training exercises, scouted new territories, and maintained their readiness for war. The threat of swift and decisive retaliation was one of the main reasons the empire could maintain order over such a vast and diverse population. However, beneath this golden age, there were challenges that would later contribute to the empire's decline. The vast distances that had once been bridged by the Yam network and the unity of leadership would, over time, become harder to manage as different branches of Genghis Khan's descendants ruled separate khanates. But in the mid-13th century, these divisions had not yet fractured the empire. The central authority, embodied in the Great Khan, was still respected, and the system of governance was functioning effectively. This period was, in many ways, the height of Mongol achievement. The combination of political stability, economic integration, and cultural exchange made the empire not just a military power but a driver of global connections. While the Mongols are often remembered for their conquests and destruction, Their role in creating a more interconnected Eurasia during their peak is equally significant. For merchants, scholars, and ordinary travelers, the empire offered opportunities that had not existed before. Roads were safer, markets were larger, and the movement of ideas was faster than at any time in living memory. By the time Kublai Khan came to power and established the Yuan dynasty in China in 1271, the Mongol Empire was already a vast and complex system. While the capital shifted to Kambalik, modern-day Beijing, the principles established earlier, efficient communication, promotion of trade, religious tolerance, and the use of local administrative expertise, remained central to Mongol rule. These principles allowed the empire to maintain its dominance well into the late 13th century, shaping the course of history across 2 continents. The Mongol Empire's dominance during its peak was not merely a military phenomenon. It was also a period of vast political stability, cultural exchange, and unprecedented connectivity across Eurasia. By the mid-13th century, under the leadership of Genghis Khan's successors, particularly Ogdi Khan, and later Monk Khan and Kublai Khan, the empire reached its maximum territorial extent. From the shores of the Pacific Ocean to the edges of Eastern Europe, and from the frozen steppes of Siberia to the mountains and deserts of the Middle East, the Mongols controlled an immense swath of land that no single polity before or after has ever matched in contiguous size. This control, maintained through a combination of fear, diplomacy, and efficient administration, allowed the Mongols to oversee the most significant period of intercontinental trade and cultural interaction the world had seen up to that point. The Mongol administrative approach was pragmatic and often adaptable. While their initial conquest had been characterized by ruthless destruction, once a territory was incorporated into the empire, it became part of a complex and organized network of governance. Local rulers were often retained if they pledged loyalty and paid tribute, and the Mongols frequently adopted and adapted existing systems of administration to suit their needs. In China, they utilized elements of the sophisticated bureaucratic structure of the Jin and Song dynasties. In the Islamic world, they worked with Persian administrators and adopted many aspects of Persian governance. This allowed the empire to function efficiently despite its vast and culturally diverse population. Trade flourished under Mongol rule, especially along the Silk Road. Before the Mongol Empire, the Silk Road had been a fragmented and often dangerous route, with goods passing through numerous hands, vulnerable to banditry and disrupted by regional wars. The Mongols, by uniting most of Eurasia under their control, effectively created a single political space in which merchants could travel with far greater safety. Caravans moved between China, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe with the backing of the Mongol postal and security systems. The Yam system, an extensive network of relay stations, allowed for swift communication and the safe passage of goods and information. Each station provided fresh horses and supplies, enabling envoys, traders, and messengers to cover vast distances in a fraction of the time it would have otherwise taken. The Mongols were keenly aware of the value of trade, not just for material wealth but for maintaining the flow of intelligence and fostering political alliances. They actively encouraged the movement of merchants, granting them special privileges such as tax exemptions and state protection. These merchants, in turn, became conduits for cultural and technological exchange. It was during this period that inventions like gunpowder, paper, and printing technology spread westward, while artistic styles, textiles, and knowledge from the Islamic world and Europe flowed eastward. Cultural exchange was not limited to material goods. The Mongol court became a meeting point for diverse peoples. Persian astronomers, Chinese engineers, European craftsmen, and Muslim physicians all found their way to serve under Mongol rulers. This cosmopolitan environment fostered a rich exchange of ideas. In astronomy, the Mongols sponsored observatories and supported the compilation of more accurate star charts, blending knowledge from different civilizations. In medicine, they encouraged the sharing of treatments and practices from various traditions, improving healthcare across their empire. Religious tolerance was another hallmark of Mongol rule at its peak. While the Mongols themselves followed a form of traditional shamanism, they did not impose it on their subjects. Instead, they allowed the free practice of religion, granting privileges to Buddhist, Christian, Islamic, and other religious institutions. This policy not only reduced resistance among conquered peoples but also contributed to the diverse cultural atmosphere that defined the empire's golden age. In terms of infrastructure, the Mongols invested heavily in maintaining and improving roads, bridges, and caravanserais along trade routes. These facilities made travel easier for both merchants and official envoys, further binding the vast territories together. The yam system was not only for communication but also acted as a logistical backbone for the entire empire. The capital of the Mongol Empire during Genghis Khan's reign, Karakorum, became a symbol of this new era. Though located deep in the steppes of Mongolia, Karakorum was an international city with markets stocked with goods from across the empire. Craftsmen from many lands were brought in to work there, creating objects that blended artistic traditions from across Eurasia. Foreign diplomats, religious leaders and merchants frequented the city, making it a hub of political and cultural activity. Yet, while the Mongols enjoyed immense power, they faced the challenge of governing such an enormous and culturally diverse territory. Maintaining unity required careful political balancing. The empire was divided into 4 large khanates: Yuan China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in Russia, each ruled by different branches of the family. At the peak of Mongol unity, these khanates cooperated closely, allowing goods and information to pass freely between them. Diplomacy was a key tool in managing relationships both within and outside the empire. The Mongols sent emissaries to distant courts, including the papacy in Rome and various European kingdoms, exploring possibilities for alliances against common enemies like the Islamic Mamluks. While these alliances often failed to materialize, they demonstrate the far-reaching vision of Mongol diplomacy. The wealth generated during this period had a transformative effect on many regions. In China, the Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan expanded agricultural production, encouraged maritime trade and invested in public works. In Persia, the Ilkhanate introduced administrative reforms and fostered scientific and artistic achievements. Even in the steppes of Mongolia, a region traditionally less urbanized, new settlements and infrastructure projects appeared, linking the nomadic heartland more closely to the sedentary civilizations the Mongols had conquered. However, the very factors that made the empire so successful, its vast size, cultural diversity and reliance on local elites, also contained the seeds of future division. The delicate balance of power among the khanates depended on strong leadership from the Great Khan, and as succession disputes became more frequent, unity began to fray. For the time being, though, the Mongol Empire at its peak was a marvel of organization, connectivity, and prosperity. The combination of military security, economic opportunity, and cultural openness created a world in which people, goods, and ideas could move more freely than ever before. This golden age left a lasting imprint on world history, shaping trade routes, political boundaries, and cultural interactions for centuries to come. The influence of this period extended beyond economics and politics. Art and literature flourished as different traditions met and merged. Persian miniature painting absorbed Chinese influences, while Mongol patrons supported the production of lavish manuscripts. Music, cuisine, and clothing styles also reflected the blending of cultures, with nomadic, Islamic, and East Asian elements appearing side by side. Even the Mongols' reputation as ruthless conquerors softened somewhat in the eyes of those who benefited from the stability and wealth of their rule. While the memory of their brutal campaigns persisted, many merchants, artisans, and scholars saw the Mongol era as one of opportunity and mobility. The Mongols' willingness to learn from and adopt foreign innovations further enhanced their legacy as both warriors and empire builders. In this way, the Mongol Empire's peak was not just about power, it was about creating connections. The period laid the foundation for a more interconnected Eurasian world, a reality that would continue to influence global trade, diplomacy, and culture long after the empire itself began to fragment. While the Mongol Empire's military achievements were extraordinary, its success during the Golden Age was equally rooted in the peace and security it fostered across its territories. Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, created a level of safety and stability for trade routes that had rarely been seen before. Merchants could travel from China to the Mediterranean with relatively little fear of robbery or local warfare. The roads were patrolled, way stations were established, and passports issued by the Great Khan gave traders protection throughout the empire. The Mongols invested in a network of relay stations known as yam, spaced roughly 25 to 40 kilometers apart along major routes. Each station maintained fresh horses, provisions, and shelter for messengers and officials. This system allowed news to travel across the empire at remarkable speed, enabling a message to cross thousands of kilometers in a matter of days. For merchants, it meant a more predictable and efficient journey, and for rulers, it was a way to maintain centralized control over vast distances. Markets flourished under this protection. Chinese silk, porcelain, and tea flowed westward, while glassware, textiles, and precious metals moved eastward. From Central Asia came horses, furs, and gemstones, while spices from India and Southeast Asia made their way across the Mongol-controlled lands. The caravan routes of the Silk Road were at their busiest, and urban centers along the way grew wealthy from the steady flow of goods and travelers. The Mongol rulers understood that trade was a source of wealth and influence, and they actively encouraged it. They lowered tariffs, removed many of the local tolls that had slowed commerce, and offered incentives for foreign merchants to bring their goods into Mongol lands. They were pragmatic in their approach, welcoming traders of all backgrounds and religions. This openness brought not only goods but also knowledge, technologies, and cultural influences. Religious tolerance was another hallmark of the Mongol Golden Age. The empire was home to Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, Taoists, and many others, each allowed to practice their faith freely. The Mongol elite often sponsored religious leaders and built places of worship for multiple faiths. This policy helped to integrate diverse populations and minimize the risk of rebellion rooted in religious differences. It also facilitated the exchange of ideas between cultures that might otherwise have remained isolated from one another. Art and science benefited from this cultural openness. Persian astronomy influenced Chinese observatories, while Chinese medical knowledge spread to the Middle East. Mongol rulers often brought artisans, scholars, and engineers from distant lands to their courts. Kublai Khan, for example, welcomed foreign architects and scientists to his capital in China, where they contributed to projects ranging from grand palaces to advanced irrigation systems. The empire's political organization contributed to its stability. The Mongols adapted elements from the administrative systems of conquered peoples, blending Chinese bureaucratic practices with Persian tax collection methods. Local leaders were often retained in positions of authority, provided they pledged loyalty to the Great Khan and met the empire's demands for tribute and order. This approach allowed the Mongols to govern effectively without the constant presence of large occupying armies. Despite the vast distances and cultural differences within the empire, a shared identity began to emerge. The use of the Mongol script and language was encouraged in administration, though local languages continued to thrive. Coins were minted bearing the names of the Khans, reinforcing their authority across far-flung territories. The empire's legal code, the Yasa, provided a common set of rules that applied from the Russian steppes to the Chinese heartland. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Mongol Golden Age was the safety it provided to travelers like Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant whose journey to the court of Kublai Khan became famous in Europe. Polo's detailed accounts of the wealth and sophistication of the Mongol-controlled East inspired generations of European explorers and traders. His travels were possible because of the infrastructure and stability created by Mongol rule. The postal system, road networks, and protection of merchants were not just tools for economic growth but also for political unity. They allowed the Great Khan to communicate orders across the empire, monitor the loyalty of distant governors, and respond quickly to threats. These systems were vital for maintaining control over such a vast and diverse realm. The Mongol Golden Age also saw the expansion of cities. Karakoram, the empire's original capital, became a thriving hub of diplomacy and trade. Later, Kublai Khan's capital at Kambalik, modern-day Beijing, emerged as one of the largest and most prosperous cities in the world. It featured wide streets, bustling markets, and impressive public works, including canals and granaries to ensure food supply. In Central Asia, cities like Samarkand and Bokhara grew rich from their position along the trade routes. They attracted scholars, poets, and artisans, becoming centers of cultural blending where Persian, Chinese, and Turkic traditions merged. The Mongols, despite their nomadic origins, proved capable city builders, investing in infrastructure that supported both commerce and the needs of urban populations. The empire's navy also played a role during this period. Under Kublai Khan, the Mongols launched maritime trade expeditions to Southeast Asia and attempted invasions of Japan. While the Japanese campaigns failed, the efforts demonstrated the Mongol willingness to engage with the maritime world, expanding their influence beyond the continental interior. However, the Golden Age was not without its challenges. The empire's sheer size made it dependent on the loyalty and competence of local administrators. Communication, while vastly improved, could still take weeks to reach the farthest corners. Internal rivalries within the Mongol elite sometimes flared, though during the peak years these conflicts were kept in check by the authority of the Great Khan. The wealth generated by trade also created new dynamics. As merchants grew more influential, their relationships with the ruling elite became increasingly important. The Mongols maintained a careful balance, granting merchants privileges but ensuring that ultimate power remained with the Khans and their appointed governors. Cultural exchanges during this period left lasting legacies. The introduction of Persian and Arab architectural styles into China influenced building design for centuries. Chinese papermaking and printing spread westward, transforming education and record-keeping in the Islamic world and Europe. Advances in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine moved along the trade routes in both directions, accelerating scientific progress across continents. The Mongol Empire's commitment to open trade and cultural exchange had far-reaching consequences. It helped to lay the groundwork for the interconnected world that would emerge in later centuries. The flow of goods and ideas across Eurasia during the Mongol Golden Age set precedents for diplomacy, commerce, and cross-cultural understanding that endured long after the empire itself declined. The ability of the Mongols to transition from conquerors to administrators was central to this success. Their pragmatic approach to governance, combined with their military discipline and logistical expertise, created a unique environment where prosperity could flourish. While their methods of conquest were often brutal, their rule during the Golden Age demonstrated a capacity for building and sustaining a vast and complex civilization. As the Golden Age continued, the empire reached a point where it was more than just a military machine. It had become a network of cities, roads, markets, and cultures bound together by a shared order. From the nomadic camps of Mongolia to the bustling ports of the Black Sea, the Mongol banner represented not just fear of conquest but the promise of stability and opportunity. In this way, the Mongol Empire at its peak was both a product of its past victories and a harbinger of future global connections. Its legacy during the Golden Age was not only in the lands it controlled but in the pathways it opened, the cultures it connected, and the vision it offered of a world linked by trade, tolerance, and shared prosperity. The Mongol Empire, at its height in the late 13th century, was the largest contiguous land empire in history. It stretched from the Pacific Ocean in the east to the Black Sea and the edges of Eastern Europe in the west, covering vast swaths of Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. But just as rapid as its rise had been under Genghis Khan and his immediate successors, its decline was equally dramatic. The seeds of this decline were sown not by external enemies alone, but by internal struggles, divisions, and the very structure of the empire itself. The unity forged through conquest began to unravel as competing ambitions, cultural differences, and the sheer vastness of the realm strained the bonds between its rulers. The first major challenge to the Mongol Empire's cohesion came after the death of Mongol Khan in 1259. Mongol, the fourth great Khan and grandson of Genghis Khan, had overseen both significant conquests and an era of relative stability. His sudden death, however, created a power vacuum that exposed a fundamental flaw in the empire's governance: succession disputes. The Mongols did not have a clear, universally accepted system of succession. Leadership was not strictly hereditary. Instead, the next great Khan was chosen through a kurultai, a council of Mongol nobles and princes. In theory, this allowed for merit-based leadership. In practice, it often became a stage for intense rivalry and civil war. Following Mongol's death, a bitter conflict broke out between his brothers Kublai and Erik Bok. Kublai, already in China consolidating Mongol control over the Song dynasty territories, claimed the title of Great Khan with the support of the Eastern Mongol elite and many subject peoples. Erik Bok, however, based in the Mongol heartland of Karakoram, had the backing of many traditionalists who feared Kublai's growing Chinese influence. This split was not merely a personal rivalry, it represented two competing visions for the Mongol Empire. Kublai sought to integrate with Chinese culture and rule as an emperor in the Chinese style, prioritizing the wealth and administrative sophistication of the south. Erik Bok championed the nomadic traditions of the steppe, wary of being absorbed into the sedentary civilizations they had conquered. The war between the brothers lasted from 1260 to 1264 and ended with Kublai's victory. But the damage was done. The empire's unity had been shattered. Even though Kublai was now the Great Khan, his authority was not recognized equally across the empire. The Western Khanates, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Ilkhanate in Persia, operated increasingly independently. While they nominally acknowledged the Great Khan, in practice they pursued their own agendas, made their own alliances and often fought with each other. The sheer size of the Mongol Empire compounded these divisions. Communication across thousands of miles, even with the famed Yam system of relay stations, was slow and unreliable. News of decisions, orders, or enemy movements could take weeks or months to reach distant provinces. Local rulers, often members of Genghis Khan's extended family, found themselves making independent decisions out of necessity. Over time, this autonomy became permanent. The empire, in effect, became a collection of semi-independent states bound together more by shared history than by active cooperation. Economic strains also played a role in the decline. While the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, had fostered unprecedented trade and cultural exchange along the Silk Road, it also required stability and cooperation among the khanates. As political unity broke down, so did the safety of trade routes. Banditry increased, local wars disrupted commerce, and the tax revenues that funded Mongol armies and administration declined. In the west, the Golden Horde faced its own internal problems. Berk Khan, a Muslim convert, clashed with his cousin Hulagu, the ruler of the Ilkhanate, over religious and political differences. Hulagu's destruction of Baghdad in 1258 and killing of the Abbasid Caliph had enraged Berk, and the two khanates went to war. This was the first open conflict between major Mongol factions, a shocking departure from the unity that had once made them unstoppable. The Berk-Hulagu War not only weakened both sides but also marked the beginning of the end for the idea of a single Mongol state. Meanwhile, in Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate was plagued by succession disputes and factionalism. Rival claimants to the throne often sought help from neighboring khanates or outside powers, further eroding trust among the Mongol states. Even the Yuan dynasty in China, ruled by Kublai and his successors, began to distance itself from the other Mongol realms, focusing more on Chinese affairs than on maintaining imperial unity. Cultural differences added another layer of complexity. The Mongols had conquered a mosaic of civilizations: Muslims in the Middle East, Orthodox Christians in Russia, Buddhists in Tibet, Confucian scholars in China. While the Mongol elite often adopted aspects of local customs and religions, these adaptations also created divisions within the ruling class. Muslim Mongols in the West had little in common with Buddhist Mongols in the East, and the shared nomadic heritage that had bound them together was gradually diluted. The decline of central authority was further accelerated by the fact that Mongol rulers often placed family members in charge of distant territories. While this kept power within the family, it also encouraged regional loyalties over imperial unity. A Khan ruling in Persia or Russia would naturally prioritize the prosperity and defense of his own domain over the abstract concept of a united Mongol Empire. By the early 14th century, the Mongol world was effectively split into four major khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China and Mongolia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in Russia. Each was ruled by a descendant of Genghis Khan, but their cooperation was minimal. They fought wars against each other almost as often as they fought against outside enemies. This fragmentation weakened the Mongols' ability to respond to external threats. In China, the Yuan dynasty faced growing resistance from the native Han population, culminating in the Red Turban Rebellion. In the Middle East, the Ilkhanates struggled against the Mamluks of Egypt, who had already defeated the Mongols at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260. The Golden Horde faced challenges from rising Russian principalities, while the Chagatai Khanate was beset by both internal strife and external pressure from the Timurids. The decline of the Mongol Empire was not a sudden collapse but a gradual process driven by a combination of political fragmentation, economic troubles, cultural divergence, and the limitations of ruling such an enormous territory. By the mid-14th century, the dream of a united Mongol Empire existed only in name. What remained were powerful regional states, each tracing its heritage back to Genghis Khan but pursuing its own destiny. The years following the death of Monk Khan in 1259 were pivotal for the Mongol Empire. His death without a clearly established successor created the first major crack in the imperial unity. The succession process in Mongol tradition required the convening of a Kurultai, a great council of nobles, to elect the next great Khan. However, this time, disagreements over both the location and legitimacy of the Kurultai caused delays and deepened divisions. Two major contenders emerged for the throne: Kublai, the younger brother of Monk, and Erik Bok, another younger brother. Kublai had been governing much of northern China and had strong support from Chinese advisors and administrators, who appreciated his willingness to adapt to local systems of rule. Erik Bok, on the other hand, had the backing of many traditionalist Mongol nobles who resided in the Mongolian heartland. They viewed Kublai's policies as a dangerous drift away from the nomadic traditions of Genghis Khan's time. The rivalry quickly escalated into open civil war. Known as the Talyuid Civil War, 1260–1264, it was not just a contest between two brothers, but a struggle between two visions for the Mongol Empire's future. Kublai's forces were well supplied thanks to the agricultural resources of China and his control over major cities. Erik Bok's troops, while fierce warriors, were at a disadvantage due to resource shortages. Over the course of 4 years, Kublai's military skill and superior logistics allowed him to prevail. Erik Boke eventually surrendered, but the damage to imperial unity was irreparable. Even before the civil war ended, the empire's distant regions began acting independently. The Ilkhanate in Persia, led by Hulagu Khan, refused to acknowledge Erik Boke and later operated with near autonomy under Kublai's nominal overlordship. In the west, the Golden Horde under Berke Khan openly clashed with Hulagu over religious and political disagreements, culminating in the Berke-Hulagu War. Berke, a Muslim, was outraged by Hulagu's destruction of Baghdad in 1258, which had been one of the great centers of the Islamic world. This intra-Mongol war in the Caucasus not only drained resources but also marked the first time Mongol armies fought each other on a large scale. In China, Kublai declared himself emperor of the Yuan dynasty in 1271, solidifying his control over the eastern part of the empire. While this was a moment of triumph for Kublai, it also signaled the formal separation of the Mongol Empire into distinct political entities. The Yuan court in China became more concerned with internal Chinese affairs than with maintaining the unity of the Mongol world. As decades passed, the different khanates, Yuan China, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Golden Horde in the northwest, pursued their own political and economic goals. Trade along the Silk Road still flourished under the Pax Mongolica, but rivalries often disrupted this stability. The Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate remained hostile, with their wars weakening both sides and opening opportunities for local powers to assert independence. Religious differences also widened the gaps between the khanates. The Ilkhanate's gradual conversion to Islam created new alignments in the Muslim world, while the Golden Horde's Muslim rulers found common cause with neighboring Islamic states. Kublai's Yuan court, however, leaned heavily toward Buddhism, especially Tibetan influences, further alienating it from the Muslim khanates. The logistical challenges of governing such a vast territory contributed to the disunity. Messages between the eastern and western khanates could take months to arrive, and local rulers grew increasingly unwilling to obey distant commands. The Great Khan's authority, once unchallenged, became more symbolic than real. Economic strains compounded these problems. While the Mongols had initially enriched themselves through conquest, maintaining large armies and lavish courts required steady revenue. In China, Kublai's costly wars, especially his failed invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281, drained the treasury. In the western khanates, wars and political instability disrupted trade, reducing tax income. During the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the plague, later known as the Black Death, swept through Eurasia. The very trade routes that had once bound the Mongol Empire together now carried the disease across continents. The death toll was catastrophic, wiping out populations in cities and countryside alike. The labor shortages that followed severely weakened economies and further destabilized political systems. In the Golden Horde, internal disputes over succession weakened central authority. Regional leaders, known as beys, began to act independently, sometimes even defying the Khan's orders. In the Chagatai Khanate, divisions between nomadic steppe tribes and settled urban populations led to constant unrest. The Ilkhanates suffered a succession crisis in the mid-14th century when the direct male line of Hulagu's descendants died out, leading to political fragmentation. By this time, Kublai had died in 1294, and his successors in the Yuan dynasty lacked his authority and political skill. Factional struggles at court weakened their ability to respond to internal revolts and external threats. In China, resentment against Mongol rule grew among the Han population, leading to uprisings that would later culminate in the formation of the Ming dynasty. Although the Mongol Khanates still shared a common heritage and often maintained diplomatic ties, the dream of a united Mongol Empire had faded. The divisions that began with the Talyuid Civil War had deepened into permanent political separation. Without a single strong leader to command loyalty across the steppes, the empire that Genghis Khan had forged was now a patchwork of rival states. The decline of centralized authority also meant that the Mongols could no longer mount large-scale coordinated campaigns. Instead, each Khanate focused on its immediate neighbors, sometimes even allying with former enemies against other Mongol states. This shift marked the transformation of the Mongol Empire from a global superpower into a collection of regional powers. The seeds of the empire's fall had been sown in the very systems that had enabled its rise. Genghis Khan's practice of dividing power among his descendants ensured loyalty during his lifetime but created rivalries after his death. The reliance on family-based succession meant that disputes were inevitable, and without a universally respected Great Khan to resolve them, those disputes turned into wars. By the end of the 13th century, the Mongol Empire's unity was gone in all but name. The once unstoppable Mongol war machine now spent more time fighting itself than expanding its frontiers. The grandeur of the empire remained in memory, but its reality was one of division, mistrust, and decline. By the early 14th century, the Mongol Empire's political structure had become deeply fragmented. The Khanates functioned less as parts of a single empire and more as independent states that often acted against one another's interests. While in theory the Great Khan was still recognized as the symbolic ruler of all Mongols, in practice the title carried little authority outside his own territory. This division eroded the unity that had once allowed the Mongols to act with overwhelming speed and power. In the Yuan dynasty of China, Kublai Khan's successors struggled to maintain control. The vast and diverse Chinese population had never fully accepted Mongol rule, and the Yuan administration became increasingly burdened by corruption and mismanagement. The empire's reliance on non-Chinese officials and favoritism toward Mongol elites alienated the local population. Revolts broke out more frequently, particularly in the southern regions, and the cost of suppressing these uprisings drained resources. When the Red Turban Rebellion erupted in the 1350s, it spread rapidly across China, fueled by discontent over heavy taxes, famine, and natural disasters. The Yuan court, weakened by internal rivalries, failed to respond effectively, setting the stage for the dynasty's downfall. In the west, the Ilkhanate in Persia was also unraveling. The death of Abu Said Bahadur Khan in 1335 without a clear heir plunged the region into political chaos. Competing factions, tribal leaders, and rival claimants fought for control, often inviting outside powers to support their claims. The Ilkhanate, once a formidable center of Mongol authority, fractured into smaller states, each governed by local warlords. These successor states often turned against one another, further weakening their ability to resist outside invasions. Trade through Persia declined as political instability made travel dangerous, undermining one of the key economic pillars of the Mongol world. The Golden Horde, which had ruled over much of Russia and the steppes north of the Black Sea, was facing its own crisis. The Horde's power depended heavily on the unity of the steppe tribes and the flow of tribute from Russian principalities. As Moscow and other centers of power in Russia grew stronger, they began to resist the Horde's demands. Internal disputes over succession within the ruling clan led to a series of civil wars in the late 14th century. Rival khans claimed legitimacy, and competing factions often invited foreign allies, including the rising power of Lithuania, into their conflicts. The once feared Golden Horde was becoming vulnerable to external threats and internal collapse. The Chagatai Khanate, covering Central Asia, had been plagued by instability for decades. Its rulers frequently switched between Islam and traditional Mongol beliefs, leading to divisions among the population. Internal tribal rivalries were constant, and the Khanate's leaders often lacked the political skill needed to maintain cohesion. In the late 14th century, the region fell under the influence of the conqueror Timur, Tamerlane, whose campaigns disrupted whatever stability remained. Although Timur claimed to be acting in the name of the Mongol legacy, his rule was effectively independent, and the Chagatai Khanate ceased to function as a unified Mongol state. One of the underlying causes of the Mongol Empire's decline was the very nature of its succession system. Unlike centralized monarchies in Europe or bureaucratic dynasties in China, Mongol succession was not based on strict primogeniture. Instead, any male member of the ruling family could potentially claim the title of Khan. This tradition had worked under Genghis Khan and his immediate successors because the family was united and the threat of external enemies encouraged cooperation. But once the empire was established and external threats diminished, succession disputes became violent power struggles. Each Khanate often supported a different claimant for the position of Great Khan, leading to wars between Mongol states that had once fought side by side. Economic factors also played a major role in the empire's fragmentation. The Mongol system had thrived during a period of expansion, when conquest brought in wealth from new territories. Once expansion slowed, the empire's revenue streams declined. The maintenance of large armies, garrisons in distant territories, and extensive administrative networks became increasingly expensive. Trade routes, once secure under the Pax Mongolica, grew dangerous as local rulers lost the ability, or the will, to protect them. Banditry and piracy increased, discouraging merchants and travelers. As trade revenues fell, the Mongol rulers resorted to heavier taxation, which in turn provoked resistance from their subjects. Cultural and religious differences further eroded unity. In China, the Mongols maintained a distinct identity, refusing to fully integrate with the local population. In Persia, many Mongol rulers converted to Islam, which distanced them culturally from their Eastern relatives. In Russia and Central Asia, a mix of Islam, Christianity, and traditional steppe beliefs coexisted uneasily. Without a common ideological or cultural bond, the Khanates drifted further apart. Alliances were temporary and often dictated by immediate self-interest rather than a shared vision of Mongol unity. External enemies took advantage of these divisions. In the West, the rising power of the Grand Duchy of Moscow challenged the Golden Horde, eventually defeating it at the Battle of Kulikovo in 1380, a symbolic but significant blow to Mongol prestige. In the Middle East, the Mamluks of Egypt consolidated their power and pushed back against Mongol influence. In China, rebel forces grew bolder as the Yuan court weakened, culminating in the rise of the Ming dynasty in 1368, which expelled the Mongols from the Chinese heartland. By the end of the 14th century, the once unified Mongol Empire existed only in name. The Khanates were independent in all but title, and even within their territories rulers struggled to maintain control. The great trade networks established under Mongol rule had largely collapsed, replaced by regional economies that no longer relied on long-distance connections. The dream of a united Mongol world, stretching from the Pacific to the Mediterranean, had faded into history. Yet the Mongols' legacy did not disappear entirely. Even as political power fragmented, elements of Mongol culture, military tactics, and administrative practices continued to influence the regions they had once ruled. In Russia, the centralized state that would become the Tsardom was shaped in part by Mongol administrative models. In China, the Ming inherited and adapted many of the Yuan's institutions, even as they rejected Mongol political control. Across Eurasia, the memory of the Mongols' rapid conquests and the stability of the Pax Mongolica continued to shape political and cultural thinking for centuries. In the final analysis, the fall of the Mongol Empire was not a sudden collapse but a slow process of disintegration. Internal rivalries, economic challenges, cultural divisions, and external pressures all contributed to the decline. The very factors that had enabled the Mongols to conquer vast territories, mobility, decentralized leadership, and reliance on personal loyalty, also made it difficult to maintain a unified state over time. By the dawn of the 15th century, the Mongol Empire as founded by Genghis Khan was gone, replaced by a patchwork of successor states, each pursuing its own path in the post-Mongol world. By the mid-14th century, the Mongol Empire was no longer the unstoppable force it had been during the days of Genghis Khan and his immediate successors. The vast territories that once stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Europe were still impressive on maps, but the unity and centralized control that had made the empire so formidable were unraveling. Internal divisions, regional rivalries, and the difficulty of maintaining such a massive realm were beginning to take their toll. While the empire had been divided into khanates decades earlier, these divisions had initially worked in a loose alliance under the Great Khan. Now, however, those bonds were fraying, and each khanate was increasingly acting in its own interest rather than in the service of a unified Mongol identity. The signs of decline were visible long before the final collapse. The Golden Horde in the northwest, ruling over much of Russia and parts of Eastern Europe, was facing both internal instability and the growing power of its Russian subjects. The Ilkhanate in Persia was experiencing political turmoil and economic difficulties. In the east, the Yuan dynasty in China, established by Kublai Khan, was becoming increasingly unpopular among the Chinese population it ruled. Meanwhile, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia was caught between the influence of its powerful neighbors and its own internal divisions. One of the key reasons for the weakening of Mongol power was the erosion of the military discipline and unity that had once defined them. The first generations of Mongol rulers had been hardened warriors, raised on the harsh steppe and accustomed to constant campaigning. By the 14th century, many Mongol leaders were far removed from that lifestyle. They had settled into the comforts of urban courts, wearing silk robes and relying on hired troops rather than leading their armies personally. The nomadic traditions that had once bound them together and given them a unique military advantage were fading. In China, the Yuan dynasty under the later Khans faced growing resistance from the Chinese population. The Mongols had ruled as a privileged elite, reserving top government positions for themselves and other non-Chinese peoples, while treating the majority Han Chinese as second-class citizens. This fostered resentment, and as the Mongols became more assimilated into Chinese court life, they lost touch with their steppe origins. Heavy taxation, corruption, and a series of natural disasters, floods, famines, and epidemics, added to the unrest. Rebel movements began to rise, most notably the Red Turban Rebellion, which would eventually grow into a massive threat to Mongol rule in China. In the Ilkhanate, based in Persia, the death of Abu Sa'id in 1335 without an heir sparked a power vacuum. Competing factions and local warlords fought for control, and the once strong administrative structure crumbled. Trade routes that had flourished under the Pax Mongolica were disrupted by political instability and by the growing threat of banditry. The Ilkhanate, which had been a key link between East and West, became fragmented into smaller states that could no longer project the kind of power the Mongols once had. The Golden Horde faced its own challenges. The Black Death, which had spread across Eurasia in the mid-14th century, decimated populations, weakening economies and military strength. The plague not only killed common people but also wiped out leaders, leaving succession crises in its wake. At the same time, the rising power of the Grand Duchy of Moscow and other Russian principalities was beginning to challenge Mongol dominance in the region. The tribute system that had once kept the Russian princes subservient was becoming harder to enforce as local rulers gained confidence and military strength. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate was plagued by division between its eastern and western halves. Rival claimants to the Khanate's leadership often sought outside allies, sometimes even appealing to other Mongol Khanates or neighboring powers, which further undermined unity. These divisions allowed ambitious local leaders like Timur, later known as Tamerlane, to rise, carving out their own realms from Mongol territories. One of the most symbolic blows to the unity of the Mongol Empire was the diminishing authority of the Great Khan. Once the supreme ruler to whom all Khans owed loyalty, by the late 14th century the title had become little more than a formality in many regions. The Khanates recognized the Great Khan in name but acted independently in practice. The political marriages, diplomatic summits, and shared military campaigns that had once reinforced the bonds between the different parts of the empire became rare. The loss of unity had a direct impact on the famed Mongol military system. Coordinated campaigns across vast distances became nearly impossible. The supply lines, intelligence networks, and messenger systems that had once allowed the Mongols to move armies with unmatched speed and efficiency fell into disrepair. Without the backing of the entire empire, individual Khanates were less able to project power beyond their immediate borders. Another factor contributing to the decline was the changing nature of warfare. In the early 13th century, the Mongols had revolutionized warfare with their mastery of mobility, horse archery, and siegecraft. By the late 14th century their enemies had adapted. Fortifications were stronger, European armies had improved their tactics, and gunpowder weapons were becoming more common in both Europe and Asia. The Mongols, who had once been innovators in siege warfare, began to fall behind in adopting these new technologies. Economically, the Mongol Empire's decline was also tied to the weakening of the Silk Road. The Pax Mongolica had allowed for an unprecedented flow of goods, ideas, and people across Eurasia. But as the empire fractured, so too did the security of these trade routes. Merchants faced higher risks from bandits and unstable local rulers. Maritime trade was becoming more attractive, especially as European powers began to explore sea routes to Asia. The shift from land-based to sea-based trade diminished the strategic advantage the Mongols had once enjoyed. Culturally, the Mongol Empire was also undergoing a transformation that diluted its original identity. In Persia, the Ilkhans and their successors had converted to Islam and adopted Persian customs. In China, the Yuan rulers had absorbed many aspects of Chinese court culture. While these adaptations helped the Mongols govern diverse populations, they also meant that the distinct Mongol steppe culture was fading. Over time, Mongol rulers were more likely to be seen as part of the local aristocracy than as foreign conquerors. This made it easier for their subjects to eventually overthrow them, as the rulers were no longer viewed as embodying the fearsome Mongol legacy. By the time the 14th century was drawing to a close, the Mongol Empire existed more in memory than in reality. The Khanates were now separate states, often at odds with one another. Ambitious leaders in surrounding regions, like Timur in Central Asia and the rising Ming dynasty in China, were seizing the opportunity to expand at the Mongols' expense. What had once been a single, overwhelming force was now a patchwork of rival powers, vulnerable to both internal rebellions and external attacks. The final decline would not happen all at once. It was a gradual process, with each Khanate falling in its own way and at its own pace. But the seeds of the Mongol Empire's disappearance had already been sown. Without unity, without the military dominance that had once been their hallmark, and without the control over trade that had enriched them, the Mongols were no longer the masters of Eurasia. They were becoming, instead, just another chapter in the long and turbulent history of the continent. By the late 14th century, the Mongol world was a patchwork of competing states. The unity forged under Genghis Khan and maintained, however imperfectly, by his immediate heirs had long been shattered. The four main khanates, Yuan China, the Ilkhanate of Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in the Russian steppes, no longer coordinated their policies, shared military campaigns, or even recognized a central authority. Each khanate was focused on its own survival, and in many cases, even that was not guaranteed. The Yuan dynasty in China was perhaps the most visible symbol of Mongol power in Asia, but it had been weakening for decades. Kublai Khan had been able to hold the throne and keep control over the vast Chinese bureaucracy, but his successors faced constant rebellions, corruption, and economic instability. Chinese resentment toward foreign Mongol rule grew stronger year after year, and local uprisings began to spread. The most dangerous of these was the Red Turban Rebellion, which started in the mid-14th century and drew support from peasants, bandits, and former soldiers. The Yuan court, plagued by infighting and unable to coordinate effective defenses, began losing control over province after province. By 1368, the rebels, led by Zhu Yuanzhang, captured the Mongol capital of Kambalik, modern-day Beijing, forcing the last Yuan emperor to flee north. This marked the birth of the Ming dynasty and the complete loss of China for the Mongols. In Persia, the Ilkhanate had already collapsed by the 1330s. Internal disputes over succession and constant power struggles between rival noble families left the state vulnerable. Without a strong central Khan, the Ilkhanate fractured into several smaller principalities, each ruled by ambitious warlords. The Black Death, which had swept through Asia and Europe, also devastated the region, killing a large percentage of the population and crippling the economy. With trade disrupted and agriculture in decline, Persian lands could no longer support a powerful Mongol army. Local dynasties such as the Jalayirids and the Timurids began to dominate the political landscape, effectively erasing Mongol authority from the region. The Chagatai Khanate, which spanned much of Central Asia, experienced its own chaos. The Khans struggled to balance the interests of the settled Muslim population in the cities with the nomadic Mongol and Turkic tribes in the steppes. Religious differences, especially the gradual Islamization of the region, added further tensions. In some areas, the Mongol elite adopted Islam and integrated into local cultures, effectively losing their distinct identity as Mongol rulers. In others, fierce tribal rivalries erupted into civil wars that further weakened the state. The Golden Horde in the Russian steppes, once the dominant power over the Russian principalities, also saw its influence diminish. By the mid-14th century, the horde was engaged in constant wars with Lithuania, Poland, and other steppe nomads. Internal conflicts between rival factions weakened central authority. Moscow, which had been a tributary state, began to rise as a center of resistance to Mongol rule. In 1380, at the Battle of Kulikovo, the Russians under Dmitry Donskoy achieved a symbolic, though not decisive, victory against Mongol forces. While the Golden Horde would continue to exert influence for decades, this battle marked the beginning of the end for Mongol dominance in Eastern Europe. Trade, which had once been the lifeblood of the Mongol Empire, also suffered greatly. The Silk Road had flourished under Mongol protection, with caravans traveling from China to Europe relatively safely. But with the empire's fragmentation, these routes became dangerous again. Banditry returned, local wars disrupted caravan travel, and many merchants sought alternative sea routes. The Mongols had built their wealth not just on conquest but on facilitating trade, and without that steady flow of goods and revenue, their economies withered. Another factor in the decline was the loss of military superiority. The Mongols had revolutionized warfare in the 13th century with their mobility, coordination, and devastating archery skills. But by the 14th century their enemies had adapted. States in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia developed better fortifications, more disciplined infantry, and improved siege weapons. The Mongols could still win battles, but they no longer had the overwhelming advantage they once enjoyed. Moreover, the fractured khanates could not field armies on the scale of Genghis Khan's unified force. The decline was not simply a matter of external enemies, however. Internal politics played a huge role. Mongol succession had always been contentious, with power often going to the strongest rather than the eldest. This system worked when strong leaders emerged, but when weaker or less charismatic rulers took power, factions immediately began plotting to replace them. Coupled with the geographic spread of the empire, which made communication and coordination difficult, this ensured that any crisis in one part of the Mongol world could spiral into a complete collapse of authority. Religious and cultural assimilation also played a part in eroding the empire's cohesion. In China, Mongol rulers had gradually adopted aspects of Chinese governance and culture, alienating some of their nomadic allies. In Persia and Central Asia, Mongol elites converted to Islam and intermarried with local families, becoming indistinguishable from the local nobility. This integration made it harder for the Mongols to maintain a distinct identity as conquerors and rulers. While this process helped stabilize certain regions in the short term, it weakened the larger sense of unity needed to keep the empire together. By the late 14th century, the Mongol world was a shadow of what it had been under Genghis Khan. The Yuan dynasty had been driven from China, the Ilkhanate had dissolved into smaller states, the Chagatai Khanate was in disarray, and the Golden Horde was losing control over its Russian territories. Although the Mongols would continue to play a role in regional politics for decades, particularly in Central Asia, their time as a world-dominating force was over. Ironically, one of the last great Mongol-style conquerors was not a direct descendant of Genghis Khan but rather the Turco-Mongol leader Timur, also known as Tamerlane. Rising in the late 14th century, Timur used many of the same military strategies that had once made the Mongols feared across Eurasia. His empire, however, was short-lived and focused on personal glory rather than reuniting the Mongol world. Timur's campaigns, while impressive, were the final echo of the Mongol age of conquest rather than a revival of their empire. As the 15th century began, the Mongols were no longer the masters of Eurasia. They remained powerful in certain pockets, especially in the steppe regions, but their ability to shape the political and economic order of the continent had vanished. In China, the Ming dynasty embarked on rebuilding the Great Wall to keep the steppe nomads at bay. In Russia, the rise of Moscow signaled the beginning of a new power that would eventually drive the Mongols completely out of Eastern Europe. In the Middle East, new powers such as the Ottomans and the Safavids emerged, taking over the territories once ruled by Mongol Khans. The empire that had once connected the world from the Pacific to the Black Sea was gone in all but memory. What remained were the stories of their lightning-fast conquests, their vast trade networks, their brutal punishments for resistance, and their surprising tolerance for different religions. The Mongols had changed the course of history, but like all empires, their reign eventually ended, undone by the same forces they had once mastered: ambition, war, and the relentless tide of change. In the mid-15th century, the Mongol Empire existed only in fragments. The once mighty Golden Horde, which had ruled over the steppes of Russia, the Caucasus, and parts of Eastern Europe, was now splintered into competing khanates. The Crimean Khanate aligned itself with the rising Ottoman Empire, gaining protection but sacrificing much of its autonomy. The Kazan and Astrakhan Khanates were targets for Muscovite expansion, as Russia grew more confident and militarily capable under Ivan III and later Ivan IV, known as Ivan the Terrible. The Nogai Horde roamed the steppes but had little political unity, surviving more as a nomadic confederation than as a true empire. In Central Asia, the remnants of the Chagatai Khanate faced similar disintegration. Timur's descendants, the Timurids, had dominated the region for a time, but their empire, too, was fractured by internal disputes and external threats. Persian influence and local dynasties slowly replaced Mongol rule. In the east, the Yuan dynasty's successors in Mongolia, sometimes referred to as the Northern Yuan, struggled to reclaim their former territories in China but faced the growing strength of the Ming dynasty, which had fortified its frontiers and launched punitive expeditions into the steppe to prevent any large-scale Mongol resurgence. The decline of Mongol power was not only a result of military defeats but also of shifting trade routes and economic changes. During the height of their empire, the Mongols had controlled the Silk Road, ensuring the flow of goods, culture, and information across Eurasia. But by the late Middle Ages, maritime trade was increasingly favored. European nations, spurred by the age of exploration, sought direct sea routes to Asia, bypassing the overland Silk Road entirely. The economic incentive to dominate the steppe diminished, leaving the Mongol successor states without the revenue and strategic importance they once enjoyed. The Black Death had also left lasting scars. The pandemic of the 14th century had spread along Mongol trade routes, decimating populations across Eurasia, including in Mongol heartlands. The loss of manpower weakened armies, reduced the ability to collect tribute, and slowed recovery after wars. Depopulated towns and weakened agricultural systems made it harder for Khans to project power beyond their immediate domains. Diplomatic isolation further eroded Mongol influence. In the 13th century, the Mongols had been feared and respected by nearly every kingdom and empire. By the 15th century, they were seen as fading powers, useful only as allies in regional disputes. The Ottomans used the Crimean Khanate as a frontier defense against Muscovy and Poland-Lithuania, while the Ming used diplomacy to keep steppe leaders divided. Without unity, the Mongols could not resist encroachment from multiple directions. One by one, the Mongol successor states fell to expanding neighbors. In 1552, Ivan IV conquered Kazan, ending Tatar control over the Volga heartlands. 2 years later, Astrakhan fell, giving Russia control over the lower Volga and access to the Caspian Sea. The Nogai horde was driven eastward and southward, its power broken by both Russian advances and internal rifts. By the late 16th century, Russian fortresses dotted the steppe, signaling a permanent shift in power from nomadic to sedentary states. In Central Asia, Uzbek tribes rose to dominance, absorbing the territories of the Chagatai Khanate and forming the basis of future khanates like Bokhara and Khiva. These states retained some steppe traditions but operated within a settled, agricultural framework. In Persia, the Safavid dynasty consolidated control, erasing the last vestiges of Mongol authority in the region. Mongolia itself remained a bastion of nomadic culture, but even there, the days of empire were over. The northern Yuan Khans maintained a loose confederation, occasionally raiding into Ming territory, but they lacked the resources to mount sustained campaigns. In the 17th century, a new power from the north, the Manchus, would rise and eventually conquer Mongolia, folding it into the Qing Empire. Culturally, the Mongol legacy persisted long after political power faded. Across Eurasia, the memory of their vast empire influenced art, literature, and national identities. In Russia, the long period of Mongol dominance, often referred to as the Tatar yoke, shaped political centralization and military organization. In China, the Mongol Yuan dynasty left a mark on administrative systems, infrastructure, and cultural exchange. In Central Asia and the Middle East, Mongol rule had facilitated the blending of cultures, languages, and traditions, some of which survived for centuries. Historians have debated whether the Mongol Empire's end was inevitable or avoidable. Some argue that the very system that allowed the Mongols to rise, tribal alliances, reliance on charismatic leadership, and a mobile horse-based military, was unsustainable in the long term once vast territories required complex administration. Others suggest that external pressures such as the rise of gunpowder empires like the Ottomans, Safavids, and Ming, made Mongol dominance impossible to maintain. By the 18th century, the political reality was clear. The Mongol Empire, as a unified force, was gone. The lands they had once ruled were now part of powerful sedentary states. Yet their influence lingered in the genetic, cultural, and historical fabric of Eurasia. Trade routes they had protected were still in use, cities they had founded or rebuilt continued to thrive, and stories of their conquest remained embedded in the histories of dozens of nations. The disappearance of the Mongols as an empire did not erase their people. Mongol tribes continued to live in Mongolia and other parts of Asia, maintaining traditions of horsemanship, herding, and clan loyalty. Even as they adapted to changing political realities, the memory of Genghis Khan remained a unifying symbol. In the 19th and 20th centuries, nationalist movements in Mongolia would revive his image as a source of pride and identity, long after the empire itself had vanished. In the grand arc of history, the Mongol Empire's lifespan was relatively short, about a century of unity, followed by another century of powerful successor states. Yet its impact was immense. It reshaped borders, redefined trade, and connected the farthest reaches of Eurasia in ways no empire had done before. The final chapters of its history show not only the fragility of power but also the enduring nature of cultural legacy. When the last khanates fell, and the steppe no longer echoed with the thunder of Mongol cavalry, an era ended. But the world they had altered was forever changed, and in that sense the Mongols never truly disappeared.